Hello beautiful people. Welcome to Vision Harry. In today's episode, we explore, what if Goblin Healer scanned Harry at age 4 and found Dumbledore placed Horcrux Fragment to control Boy Who Lived. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Scan. The letter had no return address, no official seal, and no signature. It arrived at Gringotts Bank on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the iron-reinforced door of the Inheritance and Estates Department by a hand that the security enchantment somehow failed to record, which was, in itself, deeply suspicious, because Gringotts security enchantments did not fail. Griphook found it when he came in at dawn. He was a junior clerk, third tier, assigned to the least glamorous work the bank had to offer, cross-referencing dormant accounts, flagging irregularities, sending reminder notices to wizards who hadn't touched their vaults in decades. It was tedious work. Most goblins his age considered it punishment. Griphook considered it an education. He picked up the envelope, turned it over twice, and felt the faint warmth of magic still clinging to the parchment, old magic, not the kind you learned at school. The kind that came from blood and intent and something older than either. He set it on his desk and opened it with a letter knife. Inside was a single line. Check the Potter Inheritance scan. It was never completed. Griphook sat very still for a long moment. Then he pulled up the file. James and Lily Potter had died on the 31st of October, 1981. Their estate, considerable, ancient, the kind of wealth that had been accumulating since before the Ministry of Magic existed, had been flagged for the standard inheritance protocol. A scan of the heir, one Harry James Potter, age 15 months, to confirm identity, health, and magical status. Standard procedure. Always done within the first year of the heir's life, or upon the death of the primary account holders. The file said the scan had been completed on the 14th of November, 1981. It listed the results as nominal. It was signed by a clerk named Sharpthorne, who had retired 3 years later and moved to the Frankfurt branch. Griphook was very good at his job. He noticed, immediately, that the file had been updated on the 14th of November, 1981, but that the original scan record, the actual magical document that should have been generated by the scanning ritual itself, was missing. What remained was a summary. A clerk's note. A piece of paper that said we did the scan and everything was fine, without the underlying evidence that would prove it. He sat with that for about 4 minutes. Then he went to find his supervisor. His supervisor told him he was being paranoid. Told him records got lost. Told him Sharpthorne had been sloppy with paperwork and everyone knew it. Told him to file it under administrative anomalies and move on. Griphook filed it under administrative anomalies. Then he made a personal copy and sent it, through a channel his supervisor didn't know about, to the desk of Chief Auditor Boneseeker, who was not just an auditor, despite the title, but the finest diagnostic healer in Gringotts, possibly in Britain, and who had a particular interest in cases involving magical children. He got a response in 2 hours. It said, "Find the child. Where is he?" It took Griphook the rest of the day to dig through ministry records, property registrations, and a network of goblin informants embedded in Wizarding Society, and what he found made him sit back in his chair and feel something he didn't usually feel. Unease. Harry James Potter, sole heir to the most ancient and noble house of Potter, was living at number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, with his mother's Muggle sister and her husband. He had been placed there the night of his parents' deaths by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, who had left him on a doorstep in November, in the cold, without so much as knocking on the door first. There was no legal documentation. No guardianship transfer signed by a goblin notary, which was required by the oldest banking laws for any account holder under 17. No record of the Potter family will being read or honored, and Griphook was quite certain, given the Potters' social standing, that there was a will. There was always a will. He wrote back to Boneseeker, found him. "You're not going to like where." Boneseeker wrote back in 20 minutes, "Book a scan. Don't tell anyone above junior clerk rank. Don't tell anyone outside this department. Especially don't tell anyone who might feel obligated to inform the headmaster of Hogwarts. Griphook booked the scan. He listed it in the internal records as a routine inheritance audit. He arranged transport, and a goblin escort, and all the paperwork that would make this look like the most boring administrative errand in Gringotts history. Then he went home, ate dinner, and didn't sleep much. The house on Privet Drive was exactly what Griphook had expected and also, somehow, worse. It sat in a row of identical houses on an identical street, and everything about it was aggressively ordinary: the neat garden, the freshly painted number on the door, the car in the driveway that was slightly more expensive than the neighbors' cars, placed just so, to make exactly that point. The Dursleys were people who cared enormously about appearing not to care about things, and the effort of that performance had calcified into every brick. Griphook was accompanied by 2 goblin guards, large, expressionless, wearing glamours that made them look like unusually short and severe solicitors, and Boneseeker herself, who was ancient and small and moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had been doing things correctly for so long that incorrectness had simply ceased to be a concept she recognized. They knocked at 8 in the morning on a Wednesday. Vernon Dursley answered the door in his work clothes, briefcase in hand, already red in the face despite the early hour. He looked at them. He looked at the official Gringotts letterhead on the document Griphook held up. He turned slightly more red. "What's this about?" he said, with the tone of a man who believed that bluster was a substitute for authority. "This," Boneseeker said, "is about a mandatory inheritance scan of a Gringotts account holder residing at this address. You are Vernon Dursley. You are not a Gringotts account holder. You will permit us entry." She paused. "Or we will exercise our legal right to enter regardless, and I will make certain the Ministry's Muggle-worthy excuse committee is made aware of exactly how many times in the past 3 years a small child at this address has been treated at the local A&E for injuries consistent with," she glanced at the paper in her hand, though they both knew she had memorized it, "remarkable clumsiness. Shall we come in?" Vernon Dursley stepped aside. His briefcase dangled from one white-knuckled hand. Petunia Dursley was in the kitchen. She was a thin, nervous woman with a long neck and large eyes that were currently very wide and fixed on the 3 goblins walking into her sitting room with the calm of people who owned the place. Her son, a large, pink boy of about 5, was sitting at the kitchen table eating a quantity of bacon that seemed statistically improbable. He stared at the goblins with open, uncomplicated interest. There was no sign of another child. "Where," Griphook said, pleasantly, "is Harry Potter?" A pause stretched out. Petunia's eyes moved toward the ceiling, then snapped back. It lasted half a second. Boneseeker had already started toward the hallway. The cupboard under the stairs was locked. It was a small lock, cheap, the kind you could buy at any hardware shop, but someone had added a sliding bolt at the top that a small child could not have reached. Boneseeker looked at the bolt for one long moment. Then she looked back at Petunia Dursley, who had followed them into the hallway. "Key," Boneseeker said. "He's being punished, Key." Petunia produced it from her apron pocket with shaking hands. The lock clicked open. The bolt slid back. Inside the cupboard, on a small cot that was barely wider than a shelf, under a thin blanket printed with faded cartoon spiders, was a child. He was small, too small for 4 years old, and Griphook had looked up his birth date, July 31st, 1980, so he was definitely 4. Too thin. Dark-haired, with a chaos of it that no amount of cutting would ever fully tame. He had been asleep, or something adjacent to sleep, the shallow, easily shattered rest of someone accustomed to being woken suddenly, and he was awake now, blinking at them with eyes that were an extraordinarily vivid green. There was a scar on his forehead, lightning-shaped, pale against his skin. He looked at the 3 goblins in his doorway without fear. That was the first thing Griphook noticed. Most adults were at least momentarily unnerved by goblins, by the teeth and the sharp edges and the sense of something very old and not particularly interested in human comfort. This 4-year-old looked at them the way you looked at something unexpected but not threatening, with assessment, with curiosity, with a cautious wait-and-see. "Hello," he said. His voice was small and a little rough, like he hadn't used it yet this morning. "Hello, Harry Potter," Bone Seeker said, and her voice did something that voices didn't usually do when Bone Seeker was speaking. It went gentle. "My name is Bone Seeker. I'm a healer. I'd like to take a look at you, if that's all right." Harry looked past her at the hallway, where Petunia stood rigid with something between fear and rage. He looked back at Bone Seeker. Some small calculation happened behind those green eyes. "Are you going to take me somewhere else?" he said. "Yes," Bone Seeker said. She saw no reason to lie to him. "Okay," Harry said, and sat up, and reached under the cot for a pair of shoes that were 2 sizes too big. They brought him to Gringotts. Not through the public entrance on Diagon Alley, where people might see and recognize and report, because at 4 years old Harry Potter was already famous in a way that he himself seemed entirely unaware of, and the last thing Bone Seeker needed was a well-meaning wizard sending a Patronus to Dumbledore. They used the secondary entrance, the one most wizards didn't know existed, set into the back of a building on Nocturne Alley that looked like a pawn shop and was in fact one of 6 emergency access points into the bank's interior. Harry walked through the corridors of Gringotts' lower levels with his 2 big shoes slapping slightly on the stone floors and his head turning in every direction. The ceilings here were high and vaulted and lined with the kind of torches that burned gold instead of orange, and the walls were carved with figures that moved slowly when you weren't looking directly at them. He didn't seem frightened. He seemed, if anything, relieved, the way you feel stepping into a room where the temperature is right after being cold for a long time. The scan room was circular, maybe 12 feet across, with a floor inlaid in concentric rings of silver and bronze. In the center was a chair that was frankly too large for a small child, padded with dark leather, with armrests carved from something that wasn't quite wood. The room smelled of old magic the way a library smells of old paper, not unpleasant, just dense with time. "Sit here, please," Bone Seeker said. Harry climbed into the chair. His feet didn't reach the floor. He looked at the rings on the ground, the carved walls, the collection of instruments on the table to his left that would have looked more at home in a medieval workshop than a bank. "What does the scan do?" he asked. "It tells me what's inside you," Bone Seeker said, selecting her instruments with practiced efficiency. "Like an X-ray?" She glanced at him. "Something like that. More precise. It reads your magic as well as your body." She paused. "Has anyone ever scanned you before? Used a wand near your forehead?" Harry thought about it. "Aunt Petunia says I'm not supposed to talk about magic." "Your Aunt Petunia," Bone Seeker said, with measured neutrality, "is not in charge here." She positioned the first instrument, a long rod of silver set with 3 stones that shifted color in response to magical proximity, about 6 inches from Harry's scar. "This won't hurt. If it does, tell me immediately." "Okay." She began. The scan started the way these things always started, a low hum, the stones in the rod cycling through their color spectrum, the rings on the floor illuminating in sequence as the magic mapped the contours of the child in the chair. Bone Seeker watched the readouts with the attention of someone who had done this 10,000 times, reading the colors and patterns the way a musician reads sheet music, not consciously processing each note, just listening for when something was wrong. She found the first thing wrong in approximately 40 seconds. The rod's central stone, which should have been cycling smoothly through the spectrum, stuttered. Locked on black for a fraction of a second. Moved on. She made a note and adjusted the calibration, sharpened the focus, moved the rod 2 inches closer to the scar. Black again. Longer this time. Bone Seeker set down the rod and picked up the second instrument, a flat disc of burnished bronze covered in runes so fine they were barely visible, warm to the touch even when no magic was actively flowing through it. She held it above the scar. Closed her eyes. What she felt made her open them again very quickly. She stood there for a moment. Just stood. Then she turned to Griphook, who was waiting by the door with his arms folded, and she said, in gobbledygook, so Harry couldn't understand, "I need you to leave the room and get Ragnarok. Now." Don't explain on the way. Just get him here. Griphook looked at her expression. He left immediately without asking why. She turned back to Harry, who was watching her with those green eyes that missed nothing. Is something wrong? He asked. Yes, she said. She pulled a stool from the corner and sat on it so she was at his eye level. Harry, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, even if the answers seem strange or wrong. Can you do that? Yeah. Do you ever have dreams where you see things, places you've never been, people you don't know? Particularly dark places. Red light. Sometimes a voice. The change in his face was small but unmistakable. Something in the eyes that was the particular expression of a child who has been told their experiences are not real and has started to believe it. Sometimes, he said. When you're angry or scared, does the magic come out in ways that seem bigger than it should be? More than just moving objects or lights flickering. He was quiet. You won't be in trouble, she said. I promise you, not here, not with me. Goblin law does not punish accidental magic in minors. You have my word. The neighbor's roses, he said, finally. When Uncle Vernon, when I got scared. They just all died. Like, all at once. And the grass around them went brown in a circle. Bone Seeker nodded slowly. And the suppression? The feeling that most of the time the magic is muffled. Like trying to shout through a wall. Harry stared at her. How did you know about that? Because, she said, someone made it that way. And I'm going to fix it. Ragnarok arrived 14 minutes later. He was the director of the entire British branch of Gringotts, a position that made him one of the most powerful figures in the magical world in a way that most wizards either didn't understand or chose not to think about too carefully. He was not physically imposing the way humans defined imposing. He was compact, gray, with eyes the color of old coins that had been passed through too many hands. But he walked into a room and the room reorganized itself around him, the way air reorganizes around something falling. He looked at Bone Seeker's readouts. He looked at the child in the chair. He looked at the bronze disc hovering above the scar, still cycling through its readings, and his expression did something that expressions on Ragnarok's face very rarely did. It went very, very still. Show me, he said. Bone Seeker walked him through it without drama, because drama was not how Bone Seeker did anything. She pointed at the readings in sequence, explained what each instrument had found, used precise technical language that Harry mostly couldn't follow, soul fragments, anchor matrices, resonance interference, and Ragnarok listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for about 10 seconds. Both things, he said. You're certain? I have run the diagnostic 3 times. I will run it 3 more if you like. The readings are consistent. Ragnarok looked at Harry again. Harry looked back at him with the same calm assessment he'd shown at the cupboard door. You're the director. Harry said. Yes, Ragnarok said. Am I in trouble? No. Ragnarok's voice was flat and certain. You are not in trouble. Someone else is in a great deal of it. He looked at Bone Seeker. What is his current magical capacity? With the suppression in place? Significantly reduced. The suppression runes are layered, for distinct enchantments, applied at intervals. The earliest appears to have been placed the night of November 1st, 1981. His current output is perhaps 30% of what it should be. She paused. Without the suppression and without the fragment, based on the underlying core readings, she checked her notes. He should be exceptionally powerful. Possibly the most significant magical core born in Britain in the last century. And the fragment itself. What is it doing to him? Passively, right now. Feeding. Drawing small amounts of magical energy. Influencing mood and dream states. And, she said, acting as a leash. The fragment is connected to its source. Whoever embedded it, and I believe we both know who embedded it, given the ambient magical signature still clinging to the outer soul layers, whoever embedded it placed a passive tether that would allow monitoring of the child's emotional state, and, under certain high-stress conditions, subtle directional influence. Not control. Not directly. But the difference between a compass and a cage is merely a matter of degree. And the runes? Ragnarok said. The compulsion enchantments. Loyalty runes, primarily. Keyed to respond to a specific magical signature, not quite a person's signature, but a constructed one. A greater good matrix, which is a very old piece of enchantment work that I have not seen used since the early 17th century. It compels the bearer to, over time, orient their trust, their obedience, and their perception of safety toward whoever holds the key signature. Ragnarok looked at the readouts. Who holds the key signature? Bone Seeker put a small paper on the table between them. On it she had written one name. Ragnarok looked at it for a long time. Then he folded the paper, placed it in his jacket, and turned to Harry, and said, "Harry. I'm going to explain something to you. I need you to listen carefully." "Okay," Harry said. "There are things inside you that do not belong to you. They were put there without your knowledge or consent, by a person who does not have your best interests in mind. We are going to remove them. The process will take some time, and it will be uncomfortable in places, but Bone Seeker is the finest healer in this country and you will be safe. Do you understand?" Harry absorbed this with the particular processing speed of a child who has learned that bad things can be named if you're brave enough to let them. "The voice in the dreams," he said. "The cold, angry one." "Yes," Ragnarok said. "Get it out," Harry said. "Not please. Not a question. Just a statement of fact, delivered without drama. Get it out." As if it had been his plan all along and he'd simply been waiting for someone capable enough to arrive. Ragnarok looked at him, really looked, the way you look at something that surprises you, which didn't happen to Ragnarok often. "We will," he said. They moved him to the healing wing while the preparations were made. It was a suite of 3 rooms, stone-walled and quietly lit, smelling of herbs that had no English names and mineral compounds that Bone Seeker mixed herself. There was a proper bed with clean linen, and someone brought food, a lot of it, more than a child should need, but Bone Seeker had looked at the intake notes from the Desley household and her expression during that review had been something she didn't often permit herself, something adjacent to fury, and Harry ate with the focused, methodical efficiency of someone who understood, on a very fundamental level, that food was not to be taken for granted. Griphook sat with him while he ate. He'd been assigned, somewhat to his surprise, as Harry's liaison, the person who would answer questions, explain procedures, manage the bureaucratic dimension of what was rapidly becoming the most significant case in Gringotts' modern history. "What happens after?" Harry said, between bites. "After you take the bad thing out." "That depends on several factors," Griphook said. "On what?" "On what you want. On what the law says. On what Ragnarok decides." "What do I want?" Harry said, like he was testing the phrase out. Like it was new. Griphook looked at him. "What do you want?" Harry thought about it. He ate a piece of toast. He thought about it some more. "Not to go back," he said. "Then you won't," Griphook said, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he meant it entirely. "What about my aunt?" "She'll, your aunt has no legal standing over a Gringotts account holder. She was never granted guardianship through proper channels. The person who placed you with her acted without legal authority, and that placement is therefore void under the oldest banking laws in Britain, which predate the Ministry of Magic by approximately 600 years. He paused. "Your aunt cannot come and take you back. No one can, without going through us first." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not quite relief, because relief implies you've been tense, and Harry had been tense for so long that he no longer had a reference point for what not tense felt like. But something. "What about him?" Harry said. "The person who put the things in me." Can he come? He can try, Griphook said. The dryness in his voice was not accidental. We would enjoy that conversation. Harry almost smiled. It was a small thing, a brief thing, but it happened. Griphook filed it away. The healer, Bone Seeker, Harry said. She's been doing this a long time. She's been doing this for 147 years, Griphook said. She has never lost a patient. Okay, Harry said. Then I trust her. He said it the way you say something when trust is not a gift you give easily, which meant it landed differently than it would have from a child who hadn't learned yet what trust actually costs. The preparation took 3 hours. Bone Seeker worked with 3 assistants and Ragnarok observing, and they moved through the room with the quiet, coordinated precision of people who had rehearsed this, because they had, in a sense, Bone Seeker running the team through theoretical scenarios for 2 hours that afternoon before she was willing to begin. The fragment was the first concern. A Horcrux, and there was no longer any question about what it was. The diagnostic instruments had been clear and Bone Seeker had seen one once before, in 1943, related to a different case that she had never been permitted to fully discuss. A Horcrux fragment embedded in a living person was one of the most dangerous magical objects in existence. Removing it was not simply a matter of extracting something. The fragment had spent 3 years sending tiny roots into the surrounding magical tissue, not enough to be noticed during a casual examination, but enough that a careless extraction would damage the host. You had to be careful. You had to be slow. And you had to be absolutely certain you got everything, because a fragment of a fragment was still a fragment, and even the smallest piece of a fractured soul carried all the potential malice of the whole. Harry lay very still through the procedure. He had been given something for the pain, a goblin compound, not a wizarding potion, because Bone Seeker trusted her own pharmacopoeia, and it kept the worst of it away, but he was clearly aware of what was happening. His hands gripped the sides of the table and his jaw was set and his breathing was controlled in the particular way that suggested someone was working very hard to keep it controlled, but his eyes stayed open and his green gaze moved steadily around the ceiling, taking in the carved stone, the moving figures, the torchlight, keeping himself grounded in a physical world while Bone Seeker did things to the inside of his soul. The fragment came free at 11:47 at night. It looked like nothing, a smear of shadow in a glass containment vial, shapeless and cold. But the cold it radiated was not temperature. It was the cold of something that had been severed from the natural order of things and knew it. Bone Seeker sealed the vial, double-sealed it, handed it to one of her assistants with instructions that it was to go to the maximum security vault immediately, and turned back to Harry. Done, she said. Harry breathed. Long and slow and deep, like a window had been opened. The other things, he said. The runes. Those come next, she said. Rest for 20 minutes first. I'm fine. 20 minutes, she said, with the infinite patience of someone who was not going to negotiate. Your body just went through something significant. 20 minutes. Harry looked at her. Then he closed his eyes. And within about 4 minutes he was asleep, real sleep, the sudden boneless drop of a child whose system has finally, after years of guarding itself, decided to let go. Bone Seeker looked at him sleeping. She looked at the vial in her assistant's hands. She looked at Ragnarok. The runes will be straightforward compared to this, she said. They're surface layer. Elegant work, technically, whoever placed them knew what they were doing, but surface layer. An hour, perhaps 2. And after? Ragnarok said. After, she said, we see what's actually in there. What he actually is, without the suppression. Ragnarok nodded once. He looked at the sleeping child in the way that a person looks at something that has just changed the shape of the world they thought they were living in. We will need to be very careful, he said. About what comes next. About who knows and when. One person already knows something is happening, Bone Seeker said. The letter. Yes. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Someone inside the system. Someone who knew about the scan record and knew it had been falsified. Someone who wanted this found. He looked at the sealed door. I want to know who sent that letter. So do I, Griphook said, from the doorway, where he'd been standing so quietly they'd almost forgotten him. But right now I think what matters more is that they were right. He looked at the sleeping child. Everything they said would be there, was there. Which means someone with access to the truth decided we were the ones who should know it. He paused. I find that interesting. Ragnarok turned to look at him. You're thinking like an auditor. Someone has to, Griphook said. The torches burned steadily. Outside, the city of London moved through its night, entirely unaware that something significant had just shifted in the basement of a bank in the middle of Diagon Alley. Albus Dumbledore was presumably sleeping in his tower at Hogwarts. Voldemort, what remained of him, drifted somewhere in the Albanian forests, 7 souls spread across 7 objects, and one of those objects was now sealed in a maximum security Gringotts vault with enchantments designed to contain things that wanted to unmake the world. Harry Potter slept in a clean bed for the first time in his life. The rune removal began at 1 in the morning, with Boneseeker working by torchlight and Harry awake again, steady and calm, watching the ceiling while layer after layer of someone else's intentions was carefully, methodically, permanently stripped away. At 3:15 in the morning, it was done. Boneseeker ran the diagnostic one final time. The instruments cycled through their readings. The stones in the rod moved through the full spectrum, clean, uninterrupted, no stutters, no shadows, nothing that wasn't exactly what it should be. She looked at the core reading. The actual number, the raw measurement of magical potential that the deepest scan produced, the thing that had been sitting underneath 3 years of suppression enchantments like a river under ice. She looked at it for quite a long time. Then she said, quietly, in gobbledygook, Ragnarok. Come look at this. Ragnarok came and looked. He said nothing for a long moment. Is that accurate? He said. I've calibrated twice, she said. Yes. Another long silence. Does he know? Ragnarok said. Boneseeker looked at Harry, who had fallen asleep again during the final stages of the rune removal and was lying with one hand curled under his cheek, dark hair across his forehead, the lightning scar still visible but looking somehow smaller now, or not smaller, just less significant, less loaded, like a word in a sentence that has been given back its original meaning. Not yet, she said. He will. Outside, something cracked in the stone wall above the door, a hairline fracture, running 2 feet before it stopped, triggered by no visible cause. The air in the room, which had been still, moved briefly like a breath. The torches flared. Then settled. Boneseeker made a note. She did not look alarmed. She looked, if anything, like someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed, which was the closest she came to satisfied. We'll need more room, she said. Griphook was the one who sat with Harry in the morning, when the sun came through the ventilation shafts and the bank above them began its daily roar of commerce and the smell of whatever the kitchens were making for breakfast drifted through from somewhere deeper in the complex. Harry woke up and lay still for a moment in the way you do when you're in a new place and need a second to remember why. Then he remembered. His hand went to his forehead, to the scar, and he pressed 2 fingers against it and held them there. Different, he said. Yes, Griphook said, from the chair by the wall. Quieter, Harry said. Inside. He looked at the ceiling. The cold thing is really gone. In a vault, Griphook said. Sealed. It can't reach you. Harry pressed his fingers against the scar for another second. Then he lowered his hand. And the other stuff? The things that were making me, he searched for the right word. He was 4 years old. He settled for, foggy. Gone, Griphook said. Harry sat up. He looked around the room with those green eyes, and Griphook watched the change happen in real time, subtle, the way sunrise is subtle, not dramatic, just a gradual clarity. Like someone adjusting the focus on a lens. I'm hungry, Harry said. Griphook almost smiled. I'll arrange breakfast. He stood to go, but Harry said, "Grip hook." He turned. Harry was looking at him directly, with the kind of eye contact that most adults found uncomfortable coming from a small child. "Thank you," Harry said. "For the letter. The one that started this." Grip hook was very still. "I don't know what you mean." Harry looked at him for a moment longer. "Okay," he said, easily, and lay back on the pillow, and looked at the ceiling with something on his face that might, in a certain light, have been called the beginning of a smile. Grip hook walked out of the room and stood in the corridor for a moment. He thought about the warmth of magic still clinging to that parchment. The magic that the security enchantments had failed to record. The magic that had been old in a way he hadn't been able to identify at the time, but that he now thought, thinking about it carefully with the benefit of what he'd learned today, felt less like a particular person's signature and more like intent. Pure, distilled, directional intent. The kind of magic that happened when something wanted very badly to be found. He thought about that for a moment. Then he went to arrange breakfast, and filed the thought in the back of his mind under interesting, where he kept things he expected to become important later. Chapter 2, The Undoing. The morning after the procedures, Ragnarok called a meeting. Not the kind of meeting that got announced on the internal ledger, those could be seen by too many people, and too many people meant too many potential lines back to ears that Ragnarok wasn't ready to let hear anything yet. This was the kind of meeting that happened in a sub-basement conference room that didn't appear on any floor plan, with 6 specific goblins who had been chosen because they were, each in their own way, the kind of person who could hold a secret the way a vault holds gold, completely, indefinitely, and with lethal consequences for anyone who tried to take it out without permission. Grip hook was the youngest in the room by about 60 years. He sat at the far end of the table and said nothing, because the situation called for listening. Ragnarok opened with the facts. He laid them out the way you lay out a legal case, in sequence, without embellishment, with evidence at each step. The missing scan record. The anonymous letter. What Bone Seeker had found. What she had removed. What the post-procedure diagnostic had shown about Harry's actual magical core. He put the numbers on the table, literally. Bone Seeker had written them up in a single-page report that was passed around the room and read in silence that got progressively more weighted as it traveled from hand to hand. When it had gone around, Ragnarok said, "Questions." A goblin named Ironforge, who ran the Magical Contracts Division and was approximately 200 years old and had seen most things, said, "The placement runes." "You're certain of the signature?" "Bone Seeker is certain," Ragnarok said. "And she has the preserved resonance sample. It can be tested against any confirmed magical signature for comparison purposes. In a court, if it comes to that." "It will come to that," said Goldtooth, who ran legal. Her voice was the kind of flat that meant she'd already been running the scenario for 12 hours and had arrived at conclusions. "The question is when and how, not whether. Because what we have documented is the following: an illegal guardianship placement, conducted without notarization or legal process. Suppression enchantments placed on a minor without parental consent or any legal instrument authorizing the same. A loyalty compulsion matrix, which under Goblin Banking Law Section 44, subsection 7, constitutes magical interference with an account holder's autonomous will. And a foreign soul fragment embedded in the child's physical body, which is, frankly, so far outside any legal category I have ever worked with that I'm going to have to invent a new one." She looked at Ragnarok. "The question isn't what crimes were committed. The question is who in the wizarding legal system we can trust to prosecute them without the evidence disappearing." "The ministry is not an option," said a goblin called Sharpax, who ran the Foreign Affairs desk and whose particular expertise was in knowing which institutions were genuinely compromised and which were merely inefficient. "The current minister is not in Dumbledore's pocket, he doesn't need to be. Half his senior staff went to Hogwarts. Their loyalty is cultural. Show them evidence against Dumbledore and they won't destroy it deliberately. They'll simply find reasons not to act on it, which achieves the same outcome. Then we don't go through the ministry." "Not first," Ragnarok said. "We build our case. We document everything. We find every irregularity in the Potter estate records, every place where the law was bent or bypassed or simply ignored because everyone trusted the old man too much to look closely. And when we act in a way that cannot be quietly swallowed. He looked around the table. We also need to address the other matter. He put a second file on the table. Goldtooth picked it up and her expression shifted in a way that suggested she'd been expecting this. Sirius Black, she said. The Potter's account lists him as co-trustee of the estate and named guardian of Harry Potter in the event of the primary account holder's deaths, Ragnox said. He was arrested 12 days after the Potters died, charged with 13 murders and the betrayal of the Potters to Voldemort. He is currently in Azkaban. Without a trial, Goldtooth said, not as a question. Without a trial. There is no trial record. There is an arrest record, a brief note from Bartemius Crouch Sr. authorizing indefinite detention under emergency wartime powers, and nothing else. Ragnox paused. The emergency wartime powers expired in 1983 when Voldemort was declared neutralized. Sirius Black's continued imprisonment since then has no legal basis whatsoever. The room was quiet for a moment. Someone, Sharpak said, has been very busy. Someone, Ragnox said, has been allowed to be very busy, because everyone around him decided a long time ago that the man's judgment could be trusted absolutely, and they never reassessed that decision even as the evidence accumulated that it should be reassessed. He folded his hands. We will address Black's situation. Carefully, and through the right channels. There are international wizarding law provisions that override ministry jurisdiction in cases of imprisonment without trial, and Gringotts has standing to invoke them as the affected party's financial institution. He looked at Goldtooth. How long? To build a case solid enough that it can't be quietly killed. 6 months minimum. We have time, Ragnox said. What we don't have is visibility. No one outside this room can know that Harry is here until I decide otherwise. And Dumbledore? Ironforge said. Dumbledore, Ragnox said, will notice the boy is gone. He will investigate. He will apply pressure, through the ministry, through the press, through every channel available to a man of his influence. He will present himself as concerned. He may genuinely be concerned, in the way that a chess player is concerned when a piece moves off the board without his permission. He met the eyes of each person at the table in turn. He will not come here and ask directly, because he knows enough about Goblin law to know that would create a record. He will work around us. We will work around him. A pause. And when the time is right, we will not work around him. We will go through him. Directly. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Griphook walked out with a list of assignments. He was tasked with pulling every financial record related to the Potter estate going back 30 years, every transaction, every withdrawal, every legal instrument that had been filed, and cross-referencing them against the standard requirements for estate management of a minor account holder. It was exactly the kind of work he'd been doing before this started. He went back to his desk and began. Harry's education started, somewhat informally, on his 3rd day at Gringotts. It started because he asked questions and the people around him kept answering them, and at some point answering questions became explaining things, and explaining things became something that looked suspiciously like teaching. Boneseeker found him on the morning of day 3 sitting in the corner of her supply room. He developed the habit of finding corners in rooms, places where he could see everything and nothing could come up behind him, which said things about the past 3 years that she filed away under to be addressed deliberately and patiently over time, reading a text she'd left on the counter. It was a Goblin medical reference, written in English because the English version was actually more comprehensive on the subject of magical core development in human children, and it was not a book written for children. He had it open to the chapter on suppression enchantments and their long-term effects on magical development. You can read that, she said. He looked up. Most of the words. Some of them are weird. He turned the book around and pointed to a word. What's iatrogenic? It means an injury caused by the healer rather than the original illness, she said. In this context, it refers to suppression damage that continues even after the suppression is removed, because the pathways have been compressed for long enough that they don't automatically restore themselves. Harry looked at the word. Does that apply to me? Probably not, she said, sitting down across from him. The suppression was on you for 3 years, which is significant, but your core is. She considered the right word. Resilient is an understatement. I've been watching the recovery over the past 48 hours. The pathways are expanding on their own, faster than I'd expect. The suppression left marks, but your magic is filling them in. She paused. Think of it like a river that was dammed. The dam is gone. The river is remembering its banks. Harry thought about that. What does it feel like when it's fully restored? I don't know, she said. I've never seen a core like yours at this stage of development. We'll find out together. He seemed to find that acceptable. He turned back to the book. Why did he do it, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Bone Seeker looked at him carefully. Which part? All of it. Putting the cold thing in me. The runes. Leaving me with the Dursleys. He turned a page. He's supposed to be good. Everyone says he's good. Even my aunt, who hates magic, she went quiet when I said his name once. Scared quiet, not angry quiet. So he's important. And people who are important and good don't usually. He stopped. Turned another page. Why? Bone Seeker considered her response for a long moment. She could give him the sanitized version. She could tell him it was complicated, that she didn't know for certain, that he'd understand when he was older. All the things adults said when they wanted to handle rather than answer. Because he decided a long time ago, she said, that certain outcomes were worth certain costs. And he is very good at deciding which outcomes matter and very bad at seeing that the things he treats as costs are people. Harry looked up from the book. He's not cruel, she continued. In the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel, I don't believe that. I think he looked at you when you were a baby and saw a solution to a problem, and he arranged the solution with the same care and competence he applies to everything. And the part that made you a person, that made you Harry and not just the boy who lived, that part didn't register as important. She met his eyes. Some people are dangerous not because they're evil but because they're so thoroughly convinced they're good that they never check their working. Harry was quiet. He looked down at the book again. His hand, resting on the page, curled slightly at the fingers. He won't stop, Harry said. Will he? No, she said. Probably not. Okay, Harry said, and turned another page. Then I want to learn everything. The first indication that Albus Dumbledore had noticed something was wrong came on day 7, in the form of a letter to Gringotts' Director of Customer Relations, expressing mild concern about the welfare of one Harry Potter and inquiring whether the bank had any information about his current whereabouts, given that he appeared to have left his relatives' home. The letter was signed with his full name and 3 of his titles. Ragnarok read it, wrote a response on official Gringotts letterhead that said, in the polished language of institutional non-commitment, essentially nothing, and sent it back with a junior clerk. 3 days later came a second letter, slightly less mild in tone, requesting a meeting to discuss the Potter estate. Ragnarok declined, citing scheduling conflicts, and suggested they could arrange something in 3 to 4 months. Griphook, reading the copy filed in the correspondence log, noted that the second letter had been written with the particular controlled precision of someone working very hard not to write what they actually wanted to write. He had done this enough times with his own supervisor to recognize the shape of it. He noted it in his personal file and kept pulling records. What the records were showing him, the further back he went, was not dramatically villainous. It was worse than that. It was a long, quiet pattern of small adjustments, a transaction here that should have required the heir's countersignature but somehow proceeded without it, a vault access there authorized on verbal instruction rather than the required written instrument, a bequest directed to a charitable trust that bore Dumbledore's name in its founding documents rather than the listed beneficiary, each one individually explicable, together forming a picture of a man who had treated the Potter estate as an extension of his own resources for the better part of 3 years. Not looting it. Nothing so crude. Just managing it, the way you manage something you've decided belongs to you by right of competence, because you understand it better than its nominal owners. The amounts weren't the point. The principle was. Griphook filed his findings in the case document and kept going. On day 12, Harry's magic started doing things. Not dangerously, nothing exploded, nothing died, no windows shattered. But the morning of day 12, Griphook walked into the room they'd set up as Harry's living space and found that the stones in the wall to Harry's left had rearranged themselves into a rough pattern while Harry slept. Not random, the pattern had a geometry to it, a repeating motif that Bone Seeker looked at later and identified, with the expression of someone who has confirmed a suspicion they weren't entirely certain they wanted confirmed, as a spontaneous runic construction. "It's not conscious," she said, kneeling to examine it. "It's ambient. His core is expanding and it's expressing itself, I suppose." "Is that normal?" Griphook said. "For a child with a core in the 99th percentile of magical potential in recorded British history who has just had 3 years of suppression removed after a soul fragment and 4 compulsion matrices were extracted from his being?" She looked up at him. "No. It's not normal. Normal doesn't apply here. I'm making new notes as we go." Harry looked at the wall pattern with interest. He pressed his finger against one of the displaced stones and it shifted slightly, almost like it was responding to him. His eyes went wide. "I did that," he said. "In your sleep," Bone Seeker said. "Apparently you're a busy boy even unconscious." Harry pressed the stone again, more deliberately this time. The stone moved. Then the one next to it moved, unprompted, completing a line in the pattern. Harry pulled his hand back and stared. "I can feel them," he said. "The stones." He looked at his hand. "I can feel the whole room. Like," he searched for the right description. "Like when it's dark and you hold your hands out to find the walls, but it's not my hands. It's just all of me." Bone Seeker made a note. "That is magical environmental awareness. Most adult wizards develop a limited version of it with significant training. You're doing it naturally at 4 years old." She looked at Ragnarok, who had come to see what the morning's development was. "I told you we'd need more room." They moved him to a larger space the same day, a training hall, technically, one of the sub-basement rooms used for the annual competency assessments of the Goblin warrior class. It was 40 feet long and 30 wide, with a stone floor and high ceilings and walls that had been reinforced to contain a great deal of magical energy without cracking. Harry walked into it and stood in the center and closed his eyes. Every torch in the room flared simultaneously. Not dangerously, the flare lasted a second and the flames settled back to their normal height, but every single one, at exactly the same moment. Bone Seeker made another note. "All right," she said. "Let's begin properly." She started with the basics, because that was where you always started, regardless of how much potential was sitting in front of you. Magical theory, what magic was, how it flowed, the difference between ambient magic and directed magic and the narrow channel between them that was intent. She explained it in plain language, not textbook language, because Harry was 4 and his reading comprehension was genuinely impressive, but he was still 4, and plain language got to the useful part faster. Harry listened to everything and asked questions that occasionally stopped her in her tracks. On the 3rd day of lessons, she explained the relationship between emotion and magical output, how strong emotion acted as an amplifier, how fear and anger produced powerful but uncontrolled magic, how calm and focus produced precise and repeatable magic, and how the best magical practitioners learn to access their emotional power without being controlled by it. Harry said, "So the more I feel it the bigger it gets, but I need to aim it." Essentially. And the aiming is the hard part. For most people, yes. Because they can't stay calm when something big is happening. Because they can't separate the feeling from the reaction. The feeling is fuel. The reaction is the vehicle. You need to be the driver. Harry sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at one of the training dummies at the far end of the room, wooden, painted, a standard target used for goblin warrior training, and he looked at it with the particular focused stillness of someone who is not attempting something but doing it. The dummy burst into flame. Not a little. Not partially. Completely, from base to top, in the time it took Bone Seeker to blink, with a controlled precision that left the floor around it completely unaffected. The fire was green. Harry blinked. That was not what I was trying to do, he said. What were you trying to do? Move it, he said. Like the stones. Just, push it sideways. Bone Seeker looked at the burning dummy. She looked at Harry. She looked at her notes. She wrote, Day 3 of Formal Instruction. Exhibit A, Accidental Transfiguration of Directed Force into Elemental Fire. Exhibit B, Unprecedented Color Response Suggesting Deep Core Signature Manifestation. Exhibit C, I need more dummies. Right, she said. We're going to work on control before we do anything else. And you are going to tell me before you try anything, so I can make sure we're not in proximity to anything important. Harry looked at the dummy, which was still burning, because the fire was apparently not going to go out without his input. Sorry, he said. Don't apologize. Document. She handed him a small notebook and a self-inking quill. Every time something happens that wasn't what you intended, write it down. What you felt, what you intended, what actually happened. This is how we learn. Harry opened the notebook. He wrote, in the careful uneven script of a child who was still getting his letters right, tried to push the dummy. It went on fire. Fire is green. Don't know why. He looked at his own handwriting. Then he added, it was kind of good though. Bone Seeker read it over his shoulder and made a sound that was as close as she came to laughing. 3 weeks after Harry's arrival, Goldtooth came to Ragnarok's office with her briefcase and the expression that meant she had found something worth finding. The will, she said, setting a file on his desk. James and Lily Potter. I tracked down the original filing. It was submitted to the Wisengamot Records Office in 1980, standard procedure for families of significant estate. It's been sealed under a ministry security classification applied in November 1981. The classification is stamped with Dumbledore's emergency authority as Chief Warlock. Ragnarok looked at the file. He sealed his own client's will. He was not their lawyer, Goldtooth said. He had no legal relationship to the estate whatsoever. The emergency authority power that was used to seal it was intended for use in active wartime intelligence matters. Using it to suppress a private citizen's will is. She searched for the right word. Illegal, Ragnarok supplied. Spectacularly illegal, she agreed. But the beauty of using an emergency authority classification is that contesting it requires demonstrating that the original use was improper, which requires accessing records that the classification itself prevents you from accessing. It's a perfect loop. She paused. Unless you're Gringotts, and you have copies of the original filing because the bank was listed as co-executor. Ragnarok looked up. We have a copy. We have a copy, Goldtooth confirmed. Filed in the co-executor archive, which predates the ministry classification by a year and is therefore legally speaking not subject to it. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. The will names Sirius Black as sole guardian. It explicitly states that Harry Potter is not to be placed with Petunia Desley under any circumstances. Lily Potter actually wrote that impersonally, in a separate codicil, because apparently she knew her sister well enough to anticipate the possibility. It names 3 acceptable alternative guardians in order of preference after Black. It names a full trustee for the estate and sets out detailed provisions for Harry's upbringing. She placed a second document on top. Dumbledore is not mentioned anywhere in the will. Not as executor, not as guardian candidate, not in any capacity whatsoever. Ragnock was quiet for a long moment. He placed that child with his least preferred guardian, he said. The one person the mother specifically excluded. In a home with no magic, no knowledge of his history, no access to his estate, and no legal standing over him. His voice was very even. And he did it the night the child's parents died, too fast for anyone to raise the will or contest the placement. Because he needed it done before anyone looked, Goldtooth said. Before the will could be read. Before Black could claim guardianship. Before the Wisengamot could appoint an independent trustee. She sat down across from him. He was very fast. You have to give him that. I don't, Ragnock said. A silence. The international law provisions for Black, Ragnock said. Where are we? Ready to file, Goldtooth said. Under the Magical Beings Convention of 1692, Gringotts has the right to demand a formal review of the imprisonment of any account holder or named trustee held without trial. The convention was ratified by the British Ministry and they cannot simply decline to honor it. Filing triggers a mandatory review within 90 days. She paused. The difficulty is that a review will become public. Once it's public, Dumbledore will know we're moving. Good, Ragnock said. She raised her eyebrows. He continued, I want him to know. Not yet. But soon. I want him to know that we have the will, we have the scan records, we have the resonance sample of his magical signature on those runes, and we have a 4-year-old boy who is going to grow up knowing exactly what was done to him and why and by whom. He looked at the window, which looked out onto a shaft of golden light filtered down through the upper floors of the bank. I want him to know that the next time he decides to sacrifice a child for the greater good, there are entities in this world who will take it personally. Goldtooth gathered her files and stood. At the door, she paused. The review, if we file it, Black could be out in 3 months. File it, Ragnock said. She left. He sat in the office for a few minutes after she'd gone, looking at nothing in particular, in the way of someone working through a problem that has many possible shapes. Then he picked up his quill and wrote, on a fresh piece of Gringotts letterhead, a short note. He sealed it with the bank's mark, not the public seal, used for ordinary correspondence, but the older one, the seal that indicated an official communication under the full weight of Goblin banking law, which carried in the magical world something roughly equivalent to a Supreme Court ruling in the mundane one. He addressed it to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The note said, in its entirety, the account of Harry James Potter is now under the full protection of Gringotts Bank, pursuant to Article 7 of the Magical Beings Convention. Any attempt to access, influence, or relocate the account holder without a valid Gringotts order will be treated as a hostile act against the bank and prosecuted accordingly. We trust this clarifies the current situation. He sealed it and sent it by the fastest owl available. He very much wanted to see the look on the old man's face when he read it. Dumbledore's response arrived 2 days later. It was 4 pages long. It was warm, concerned, impeccably reasoned, full of indirect references to the greater good and the importance of trust and the delicate situation facing the wizarding world. It acknowledged that there may have been certain administrative oversights in the immediate chaos following the terrible events of October 31st, which Dumbledore hoped could be addressed in a spirit of mutual cooperation. It expressed deep personal concern for young Harry's welfare. It suggested a meeting at Dumbledore's earliest convenience. Between every line of warm, concerned, impeccably reasoned prose was the clear and unmistakable intent of a man reasserting his authority over a situation he had decided was his to manage, in the same tone as someone patting a dog on the head while making very clear who held the leash. Ragnock read it twice. Then he wrote his response. It was 4 sentences. It confirmed receipt of Dumbledore's letter. It noted that Gringotts' position as stated in the previous communication remained unchanged. It informed Dumbledore that any future communication regarding Harry Potter should be directed to the bank's legal department. And it signed off with the kind of institutional finality that communicated, without requiring further elaboration, that the conversation was over and the power dynamic had been established. Griphook read the exchange in the correspondence file and felt something he hadn't expected to feel when this started, something that sat in his chest like the beginning of warmth. He went back to his records work, and kept going, and by the end of that week he had assembled a case document that was 46 pages long and growing, and every page of it was another brick in a wall around one small boy with green eyes and wild hair and a magical core that was, 2 weeks after its liberation, still expanding in ways that made Boneseeker write faster in her notebook every morning. Harry had a nightmare on day 19. Not the cold-voiced nightmare he'd had his whole life, that one was gone, and its absence was its own kind of landmark, the silence after a sound you've stopped noticing. This was different. This was ordinary nightmare, the kind a child has when they've absorbed a great deal in a short time and their sleeping brain tries to sort through it, and it ended with him sitting upright at 3 in the morning in the training hall where he'd taken to sleeping. He didn't like enclosed rooms, not yet, and the hall's high ceilings and wide floor felt safer than any bedroom. With his heart going fast and the stones in the floor around his cot faintly illuminated by the ambient spill of his own magic. He sat there for a minute. He breathed the way Boneseeker had taught him, the technique she'd said was used by goblin warriors before battle, not because it was dramatic but because it worked. Slow in through the nose, hold, slow out. 3 times. His heartbeat settled. He lay back down and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the nightmare, which had been, in the way of nightmares, not really about the thing it was about. On the surface it had been about the cupboard, about the lock, about the dark. But underneath it had been about the feeling of being shaped by someone else's hands, of having your edges carved away to fit a space someone else had designed, and not knowing until now, this year, that any of that had happened. He'd been a vessel. He'd been a container for someone's soul fragment and someone's plan, and the terrifying part of the nightmare wasn't the cupboard or the dark. It was the version of himself that would have existed if none of this had happened, the version that grew up foggy and obedient and grateful to the man who'd engineered all of it, who might have loved Dumbledore because the runes had pointed him that way, who would never have known there was another Harry underneath the one that had been made. He looked at his hand in the dark. Tiny threads of green light moved between his fingers, lazy and ambient, the visual expression of a magical core that was still learning it didn't have to compress itself. He didn't find it frightening. He found it clarifying. He was 4 years old and he could not have articulated most of what he understood, but he understood it in the wordless deep way that children understand things before language gets to them, and what he understood was this: someone had tried to make him into something, and they had failed, and now he got to figure out what he actually was. He found that interesting. Not frightening. Interesting. The green light played between his fingers. He turned his hand, watching it, and very deliberately imagined it coalescing into a single point, into something with a shape. The light responded. It gathered at his fingertip and formed a small, clear sphere the size of a marble, hovering a centimeter above his skin. He looked at it. It looked back at him, in the way of light, which was really just the way of him. He held it for about 30 seconds. Then he let it disperse, and closed his eyes, and went back to sleep. Boneseeker, who had a monitoring enchantment running on the training hall as a precaution, reviewed the ambient magic readings the next morning and found the record of that small sphere of light. She noted the control it represented, the deliberate gathering and deliberate release, the precise formation at such an early stage, performed half asleep at 3 in the morning without instruction or practice. She underlined it 3 times and wrote in the margin, "He's teaching himself." On day 23, Ragnarok came to the training hall in the afternoon and watched Harry's lesson for an hour without interrupting. Harry had progressed, in 3 weeks, from pushing stones to something that looked less like a 4-year-old's magic and more like the early stages of practiced spell work, except he wasn't doing spells. He didn't know spells. What he was doing was purer than spells, raw intent shaped by focus, magic responding directly to what he meant rather than to a verbal formula he'd been taught. It produced effects that were sometimes unconventional and occasionally startling but were always exactly what he had intended. When the lesson was over and Boneseeker had gone to write her notes, Ragnarok sat across from Harry in the middle of the hall, on the training stools that had been brought in for lessons. "I want to talk to you about what comes next," Ragnox said. Harry looked at him with the full, patient attention he gave to anything he considered important. "You can't stay in this hall forever," Ragnox said. "You need an actual life. An education that isn't just magical theory and diagnostic exercises. You need to learn to read better, and do arithmetic, and eventually you'll need to know the political history of the wizarding world, and how Gringotts operates, and what your family actually was, and who you actually are." He looked at Harry steadily. "We can arrange all of that. We have resources. We have contacts, tutors, people I trust, people who will teach you honestly and not according to someone else's agenda." Harry listened. "But I want to be clear about something," Ragnox said. "What we're doing, protecting you, building the legal case, working toward bringing certain things to light, this will take time. Years, possibly. Whoever sent us that letter set something in motion, and we are moving it forward, but carefully. Because carefully is how it needs to be done." He paused. "What I'm asking you is whether you understand that. And whether you trust us to do it right." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Griphook found me," he said. "Boneseeker fixed me. You're fighting for me." He turned one hand over in his lap, looking at the palm. "I trust the people who show me with what they do." Ragnox was quiet. "I'll work hard," Harry added. "Whatever you need me to learn, I'll learn it. I'm not going to hide. And I'm not going to be afraid of him." He said him without needing to specify. He had his chance to decide what I was going to be. He was wrong about what I am. He looked up. "So now I get to show everyone." Ragnox looked at this 4-year-old child sitting cross-legged on a training stool in the basement of Gringotts Bank with green light occasionally moving through his hair like something alive, and he thought about what the magical core readings had shown, and about the compressed river finding its banks, and about the shape of the years ahead. "Yes," Ragnox said. "You do." He stood. "Lessons continue tomorrow. I'm also going to start including you in some of the financial briefings, simplified, but real. You should understand your own estate. What it is. What it means. How to use it." Harry's eyes brightened. "Can I sit in on the case meetings too? The ones about what he did?" "When you're older," Ragnox said. Harry looked like he might push on this. He considered for a moment and then seemed to decide, pragmatically, that it wasn't worth the argument yet. "Okay," he said. "But when I'm older, I want everything. Not the simplified version." "When you're older," Ragnox said, "I don't think simplified will be necessary." He left. Harry sat in the training hall for a while, listening to the deep quiet hum of Gringotts around him, the vast and ancient institution that had, apparently, decided to be on his side, and let the green light move between his fingers in small, deliberate, increasingly precise patterns. Below the streets of magical London, in the deepest vault, a glass vial sat sealed inside 3 nested containment boxes inside a room with no door handle on the inside, with enchantments designed to contain what was worst about the human capacity for darkness. The thing inside the vial knew nothing. It didn't think. It didn't plan. It simply was what it was, a fragment of intention without a home, severed from its source, trapped. Harry Potter slept without nightmares for the first time in his life. 3 floors up, in the case document that was now 53 pages long, Griphook added another entry. He wrote it in the neat, precise hand of someone who understood that what he was building was not just a legal argument but a history. A record that would matter. He wrote, Day 23. Magical core readings indicate continued expansion. No ceiling yet identified. Subject demonstrates autonomous magical control unprecedented for developmental stage. In the opinion of this investigator, the person who decided this child was a sacrificial instrument made an error so fundamental it will define the remainder of both their careers. He paused. Added one more line. We intend to be there when that becomes clear. Chapter 3, the boy who remembered 5 years is a long time to watch someone become themselves. Griphook thought about that sometimes, at the end of a long day, when the case files were stacked on his desk and the correspondence log had been updated and the financial audit had generated another 30 pages of documented evidence that nobody in the wizarding world seemed to want to look at too closely. He'd think about the morning he'd found that letter under the door, the parchment with its old, intentional magic, and the 4-year-old in the cupboard with the 2 big shoes, and then he'd look at the hallway outside his office and hear the particular rhythm of someone walking with absolute certainty about where they were going, and he'd think, 5 years is a long time. It was enough. Harry Potter at 9 years old was not what anyone who had known him at 4 could have predicted, and also was exactly what anyone paying attention could have seen coming. He was tall for his age, finally, his body having apparently decided to make up for the first 4 years of nutritional neglect in one extended growth sprint that had his tutors adjusting their estimates of his eventual height every 6 months. The wild dark hair remained wild and dark and entirely ungovernable, which he'd stopped apologizing for around age 6. The green eyes were still the same, vivid, precise, perpetually moving over whatever was in front of him with the assessing quality of someone who had learned early that paying attention was survival, and had since upgraded that skill from survival tool to competitive advantage. He was 9 years old and he read at a level that made his academic tutors quietly competitive with each other about who could find a text that would actually challenge him. He had been through magical theory, basic wandless magic, goblin history, British wizarding political history, estate law, financial management, Latin, and was currently working through ancient runes with a tutor named Scratchclaw who had been teaching runes for 90 years and had, by his own admission, never had a student who argued back this effectively. He was 9 years old and his magical core had not stopped expanding. Boneseeker's notes now constituted a separate volume. He was 9 years old and he knew, precisely and completely, what had been done to him and by whom. Ragnarok had made good on his promise. When Harry was 7, he'd started sitting in on the simplified versions of the case briefings. When he was 8, Ragnarok had dropped the simplified qualifier and just let him in. Not because Harry had pushed, though he had, regularly and without embarrassment, but because at 8 years old, sitting in on a case briefing and asking 3 questions in the first 10 minutes that Goldtooth had to look up the answers to, he had simply made the simplified version redundant. The case had grown. 53 pages had become 400. The international law filing for Sirius Black had gone through and been vigorously contested by the ministry, and was currently sitting in front of an international adjudication panel in Luxembourg, which Goldtooth described as cautiously progressing, which translated to going our way but slowly. Dumbledore had written 14 letters. Ragnarok had responded to each one with institutional non-commitment of increasing precision. The letters had grown, over 5 years, from warm and concerned to something that still wore the disguise of warm and concerned but had an edge underneath it now, the way a formally dressed man's hand tightens on the arm of his chair. He hadn't come to the bank in person. He was too smart for that, too aware of what a direct approach would create in terms of documented record. He worked through intermediaries, ministry officials who wrote to Gringotts expressing concern about the welfare of a minor, members of the Wisengamot who wanted to discuss estate management, a journalist at the Daily Prophet who had run 3 separate articles in 5 years about the mystery of the missing boy who lived, each one clearly shaped by information selectively provided to them. Harry had read every article. He'd read them with the expression of someone cataloging useful data rather than reacting to it, which had struck Griphook as one of the clearest indicators of how thoroughly the boy had grown into himself. This morning, Harry was in the training hall, which had long since been redesigned around his needs rather than the other way around. The floor had been relaid in the concentric rings of silver and bronze from the scan room, Harry's idea, which he proposed at 6 and which Boneseeker had agreed to because she wanted the ambient magic feedback the rings provided. One wall was covered in chalk markings that were half calculation, half runic diagram, half something that didn't fit either category and that Scratchclaw had suggested might be Harry inventing notation as he went. The ceiling had been raised 12 feet during the first renovation, after an incident in Harry's second year of practice that had required 3 weeks of stonework to repair. He was hovering. Not high, maybe 4 feet off the ground, in the cross-leg meditation position that Boneseeker had introduced 2 years ago. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on his knees, and the green light that played through his fingers was no longer the ambient, aimless glow of liberated magic finding its edges. It was deliberate. Structured. It moved in specific patterns through specific channels, and if you had the right instruments, which Bone Seeker always did, you could see that the patterns corresponded to the runic calculations on the wall. He was practicing them physically, running the magic through the geometric sequences, testing whether the theoretical framework held up in actual execution. It did. It consistently did. Griphook stepped into the room and waited. Harry opened his eyes, descended to the floor with the casual ease of someone standing up from a chair rather than someone who had been 4 feet in the air unsupported by anything, and looked at Griphook with the particular expression that meant he'd already calculated what Griphook was here about. The Luxembourg ruling came in, Harry said. This morning, Griphook confirmed. Goldtooth wants everyone in the conference room at 10. Which way did it go? Griphook allowed himself a small, sharp smile. In our favor. Harry looked at him for 1 second. Then he turned to the wall, picked up his chalk, and made a mark at the end of a long calculation that apparently had been waiting for exactly that variable. He put the chalk down. I'll be there at 10, he said. Tell Goldtooth I want to see the full ruling, not the summary. She anticipated that, Griphook said. She's making a copy. Good. Harry grabbed a cloth and cleaned the chalk off his hands. Is Bone Seeker coming? She said she'd try. Tell her to definitely try, Harry said, and walked out past Griphook toward the kitchens, already thinking about something else. Griphook looked at the chalk wall, the calculations, the runic sequences, the invented notation that Scratchclaw had taken to photographing and studying late at night, quietly convinced that it would eventually be recognized as original magical theory. He looked at the 4-foot drop from the height Harry had been hovering. He thought, 5 years is enough. The conference room at 10 was Ragnarok, Goldtooth, Ironforge, Sharpaxe, Bone Seeker, Griphook, and Harry. Harry had a copy of the full Luxembourg ruling, which was 40 pages long, and had visibly already read the first 20 during the 5-minute walk between the kitchen and the conference room. Goldtooth opened without preamble. The International Adjudication Panel has ruled that the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, Gringotts account co-trustee, without trial, without formal charges filed through correct legal process, and maintained beyond the expiry of the wartime emergency authority used to authorize the original detention, constitutes a fundamental violation of the Magical Beings Convention of 1692. The panel has issued a mandatory release order. The British Ministry of Magic has 30 days to comply or face the full range of convention enforcement measures, which include, among other things, the suspension of Gringotts' treaty obligations to the ministry in the area of currency regulation. She set her copy of the ruling down. They will comply. The currency regulation consequences alone would cause a financial crisis within 60 days. They will comply and they will try to make it look like their own decision. They'll spin it as a discovery of ministry error, Sharpaxe said. Someone junior will take the blame. Crouch's name won't appear anywhere in the public statement. Crouch is already a diminished figure, Goldtooth said. His son's case last year, what matters, Ragnarok said, is the outcome, not how it's framed. Black will be released. Harry, who had been reading page 21 of the ruling, looked up. He set the document down with the deliberate care of someone who is managing their reaction consciously. What happens when he's released, he said. The question was directed at Ragnarok, but its real audience was the room. He's going to find out where I am. And he's going to have feelings about that. About everything. He paused. Does he know about the scan? About what was found? He will be briefed, Ragnarok said. I'll do it personally before he has contact with anyone outside our oversight. He's going to be angry, Harry said. About the 5 years in Azkaban. About what was done to my parents' estate. About me. About what was in me. He looked at the table. I want to meet him before he's briefed. Before anyone tells him anything. The room looked at him. He was my parents' best friend, Harry said. Before any of this, the politics and the case and the legal strategy, he's just a person who lost everyone he loved and then got locked up for something he didn't do and has been in Azkaban for 5 years. I want to meet him like a person first. He met Ragnarok's eyes. Then you can brief him. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. He'll recognize you. Your face, the scar. I know. It may be an emotionally significant meeting. I know, Harry said again, in a tone that meant, I know, I've thought about this more than you have, please trust me. Ragnarok looked at Boneseeker. She shrugged in the particular way that meant, he's not wrong and we both know it. Agreed, Ragnarok said. Harry picked the ruling back up and went back to page 21. The Ministry released Sirius Black on a Tuesday in March, 2 weeks after the Luxembourg ruling, in what was described in the Daily Prophet as a review of wartime detention orders that had identified a procedural irregularity in Black's case. His name appeared in the paper's middle pages, below a story about a Quidditch result and above an advertisement for Madame Malkin's spring robes. He arrived at Gringotts the following morning, accompanied by 2 Ministry officials who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, both of whom Ragnarok declined entry to in the most technically polite way possible and with a form that took them 30 minutes to read and understand before they accepted they had no legal grounds to stay. Sirius Black, alone, was shown to a waiting room on the 3rd floor. He did not look the way Harry had expected. Which was, Harry knew, an unreasonable expectation. He had no real benchmark for what Sirius should have looked like, having only the formal portrait from the Potter estate files, taken presumably at some Ministry function years before his arrest. That portrait had shown a man who looked like someone had assembled all the ingredients for recklessness and charm and made a person out of them, dark-haired, confident, the kind of handsome that came from not thinking about it too much. The man in the waiting room had the bones of that person. But Azkaban had done what Azkaban did, and what remained was someone who was held together by something underneath the appearance rather than the appearance itself. He was thin in the way of someone recently relearning that food was available. There were gray threads in the dark hair that the portrait hadn't had. His eyes, when he looked up as Harry came in, were the color of stormy water and moved fast over everything, assessing, cataloging, the particular vigilance of someone who had survived a long time by reading rooms quickly. They moved over Harry and stopped. Harry shut the door behind him. He crossed the room and sat down across from Sirius in the chair on the other side of the low table, and he looked at the man directly, the way he looked at everything. Sirius's face did several things in rapid succession. Recognition. Then something that cracked open under it. Then the conscious effort of pulling it back together. Harry, he said. His voice was rough from disuse. Sirius, Harry said. A beat. The room was very quiet. Sirius stopped. You're big, he said, which clearly was not what he'd planned to say, and he looked faintly frustrated with himself about it. I'm 9, Harry said. I was supposed to be small at 4 but I wasn't eating right, so it's been making up time. Something moved through Sirius's face at that, at wasn't eating right, at the weight of what that phrase contained, and his jaw tightened. Where have you been, he said. These 5 years. The prophet said, no one knew where. Here, Harry said. Gringotts. Mostly the sub-basement, which is less grim than it sounds. I have a training hall. He paused. The goblins have been looking after me. And teaching me. He watched Sirius's face. Do you know what was found? When they scanned me? Sirius was very still. They mentioned, when they wrote to me about the hearing, they mentioned there had been irregularities with your placement. That the will, he stopped. James and Lily's will. It named me. I know, Harry said. I've read it. Sirius looked at him. When? When I was 7. Harry leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Sirius. I'm going to tell you something and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Can you do that? The question was genuine, not a pleasantry. He was actually asking. Sirius looked at this 9-year-old boy with James Potter's hair and Lily Potter's eyes, sitting in a goblin bank, asking him to hold his reaction, and something happened on his face that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." Harry told him. Everything, in sequence, the scan, what Bone Seeker had found, the fragment and the runes, the signature on the runes, the systematic dismantling of what had been planned for him. He told it the way Ragnarok told things, without embellishment, with evidence at each step. Sirius listened. His face went through things. His hands on the table clenched and released and clenched again. But he held it. When Harry finished, Sirius was quiet for a long time. "The fragment," he said finally. "He put a piece of Voldemort in you. In a baby." "He didn't put it there," Harry said. "Voldemort did that himself, accidentally, when he survived destroying his body by attaching to me. Dumbledore just found it and chose not to remove it." "And the runes," Sirius said, in a voice that was very level and very quiet. "The loyalty compulsion." "That was, yes," Harry said. Another silence. "Your mum," Sirius said. "She would have," he stopped. "James would have," he stopped again. He looked at the table. He breathed. Then he looked up. "What are we doing about it?" Harry felt something in his chest that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. "We're building a case," he said. "Goldtooth is running it. We have the will, the scan records, the resonance signature sample, 5 years of financial audit results showing mismanagement of the Potter estate, and now we have you, a named trustee who was illegally imprisoned the night of the same incident. That can't be a coincidence," Sirius said. "It's not," Harry said. "We know it's not. The question is proving the chain of intent to a standard that can't be quietly buried by the Ministry." He looked at Sirius. "You were arrested by Crouch. On whose recommendation?" Sirius's eyes went sharp. "Dumbledore." "Yes," Harry said. "We thought so." Sirius stared at him. "How do you know to ask that question?" "Because I've been studying this case for 2 years, Harry said simply. "And because it's mine." Sirius looked at him the way you look at something that is more than what you expected, when you had already substantially raised your expectations. Then he did something that surprised Harry, which not many things did, he laughed. Not a happy laugh but not an unhappy one either. A laugh of genuine, somewhat undone recognition. "James would have absolutely loved this," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, just a little. "He didn't try to hide it." Harry looked at him. He thought about his father, who was mostly a collection of facts and photographs, the warm-eyed man in the portraits, the skilled wizard in the history texts, the loyal friend in Sirius's broken laugh. He wished, with a sudden sharp cleanness, that he could remember him. "Tell me about him," Harry said. "When you're ready. Tell me about both of them." Sirius looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah. Okay." He reached across the table. Harry met him halfway. Sirius gripped his hand, briefly and hard, the way you hold on to something real when you've been in Azkaban for 5 years and the things you were holding in your memory have started to feel like they might be invented. Harry held on back. Sirius moved into the guest quarters in Gringotts' residential wing and the next 3 weeks were a period of mutual recalibration. Sirius needed to remember how to exist in a world with space in it, how to sleep without the stone walls pressing in, how to eat 3 meals at a scheduled time because food was reliable now, how to walk corridors where nothing was going to hurt him. Gringotts was not exactly cozy, but its underground solidity and its very particular sense of order, of everything having its correct and lawful place, turned out to be unexpectedly manageable for someone transitioning out of Azkaban. Harry gave him space in the mornings and appeared in the afternoons. He brought books sometimes, the ones from his own reading, things he thought Sirius would find useful or interesting, and occasionally things he was genuinely arguing with and wanted a second opinion on. He talked about his lessons. Sirius listened with the focused attention of someone who had been starved of the ordinary texture of life and found even these small accounts nourishing. By week 2 Sirius was attending Harry's afternoon training sessions. By week 3 he was contributing to them, not teaching, because Harry's magical development had long since outpaced what Sirius could directly instruct, but doing things alongside him, practicing his own wand work, finding his own footing with magic that Azkaban had pressed down under the weight of Dementors and despair. Harry watched Sirius's magic come back the way Boneseeker had watched Harry's come back, with the patience of someone observing a river finding its banks, and occasionally, without comment, adjusted an exercise or suggested an approach that helped, and pretended he hadn't when Sirius noticed and made a face about being helped by a 9-year-old. It was, Griphook observed from the doorway one afternoon, the most functional relationship he'd ever seen established in 3 weeks. Which perhaps said something about what both of them had been missing. On day 22, Harry said, in the middle of a working lunch where they were both reading and occasionally trading pieces of food without particular ceremony, "I want to go to Diagon Alley." Sirius looked up. "When?" "Soon. I've been in the bank for 5 years. I need to see the world." He turned a page. "Also, I've been corresponding with a girl whose mother runs an apothecary on the alley and she keeps suggesting her daughter and I should meet, and I'm curious." Sirius stared at him. "You've been corresponding with someone?" "Hermione Granger. She wrote to Gringotts about a question she had on Goblin banking history, for a school project. She's at a Muggle primary school, and somehow the letter ended up with me because someone in the correspondence department has a sense of humor." I wrote back. "We've been writing back and forth for about 8 months. Harry looked up. "She's extremely clever. I think you'll like her." "I'm sorry," Sirius said. "You've been running a pen pal correspondence with a Muggleborn witch for 8 months and this is when I'm hearing about it." "It didn't come up," Harry said. "Harry." "What?" Sirius stared at him for another moment, then put down his book, because apparently they were having this conversation now. "You can't just exist in a Goblin bank forever. You need friends. Real ones, in person." "I have you," Harry said. "And Griphook and Boneseeker." "Griphook and Boneseeker are they're wonderful but they're not, you need someone your own age, you absolute disaster." Harry considered this. "Hence Diagon Alley," he said. Sirius opened his mouth. Closed it. Picked his book back up. "Fine," he said. "But I'm coming." "Obviously," Harry said. "You know how to fly. I need someone to teach me on an actual broom and I'm not asking Ragnarok." Sirius made a sound that was mostly despair and partly love and put his book very firmly in front of his face. Ragnarok's conditions for the Diagon Alley visit were specific and non-negotiable, glamour charms on both of them until they were inside their destination, an escort of 4 goblin guards in civilian glamour, an established route with 3 exit points, and a hard time limit of 3 hours. He delivered these conditions in the flat, final tone of someone reading from a document rather than discussing options. Harry agreed to all of them and then said, "Can I have my vault access?" Ragnarok looked at him. "I've been reading about wizarding etiquette," Harry said. "Specifically around Diagon Alley. If I'm going to meet someone, I should be able to buy lunch. Also I haven't seen my vault since I was 4 and I don't actually remember it." "You've seen the audit summaries," Ragnarok said. "That's not the same as seeing it," Harry said. "It's mine. I'd like to see it." A beat. 2 hours in the alley. 1 hour for the vault. "Done," Harry said, and went to find Sirius. The glamour they settled on for Harry was unremarkable: brown hair, ordinary eyes, a face that was pleasant and unmemorable. Sirius looked at it and said it was the most tragic thing he'd ever seen. "It's functional," Harry said. "You look like someone invented a generic wizard. That's the point. James would be devastated." "James is not here," Harry said, and then heard how that sounded and looked at Sirius, and Sirius was already waving it off, the practiced ease of someone who has decided the only way to talk about grief is to not step around it. He'd also think it was funny, Sirius said. Come on. Diagon Alley in the morning was noise and color and the particular electric quality of a place where magic was just the background condition of ordinary life. Harry had seen it in illustrations, in the historical texts, in Griphook's occasional descriptions. Standing in it was different. It was narrower than he'd imagined and louder, and every shop front was doing something, owls in their cages outside Elops, the cauldrons gleaming in stacked towers outside the cauldron shop, the robes in Madame Malkin's window moving slightly as if trying to attract attention. Harry walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving over everything, filing it away with the methodical attention of someone who has been thinking about a place for 5 years and is now doing the necessary revision of the imagined version against the real one. Sirius walked beside him with the barely contained energy of someone who had been in a small stone room for 5 years and was now in a street with a sky above it, even a mostly overcast sky, even a London sky, and found it extraordinary. The apothecary, Granger's herbal emporium, wedged between a bookshop and a tea merchant, was exactly as Hermione's letters had described it. Small, crowded, smelling of things that had no business being in the same room as each other, with jars organized with fierce precision and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said "Ask before touching." The witch behind the counter was Hermione's mother, Jean, who had the look of someone who had married into the magical world and taken it as a personal challenge. She recognized Sirius. Post-Azkaban he was technically a public figure, and did not visibly react beyond a brief assessing look that clearly decided he was acceptable. She looked at Harry with more curiosity. "You must be the pen pal," she said. "Harry," he said, with the glamour still on, which made him generic wizard child. "Yes. She's in the back," Jean said, with the tone of a woman who was reserving all further judgment. "Hermione. Your friend is here." A pause from the back of the shop. Then the sound of a book being put down with considerably more care than speed required, because even urgent Hermione didn't put books down carelessly. She appeared in the doorway to the back room and looked at Harry and he looked at her, and there was a moment of mutual assessment that was almost comically similar on both sides, two people whose primary mode of engaging with the world was analysis, encountering someone else who did the same thing. Hermione Granger was 9 years old and slightly shorter than Harry, with a great deal of dark bushy hair that moved with the ambient energy of someone whose brain was always at high frequency, and large brown eyes that were doing to Harry right now exactly what his eyes were doing to her, reading, cataloging, deciding. "You're smaller than I expected," she said. "You're exactly what I expected," Harry said. She looked faintly pleased, in the competitive way of someone who had been told their self-presentation was accurate. "You read the magical theory texts I recommended?" "All 4. I had notes." "I have notes too." She turned back into the room. "Come and see what I found in the bookshop." Harry followed her into the back of the apothecary, where a small table had been colonized by books and parchment and several things that were clearly in the middle of being argued with. He sat down across from her, and the two of them immediately began talking at the speed of people who had been corresponding for 8 months and had accumulated a substantial backlog of things that were easier in person than in writing. Sirius stood in the doorway, looked at this scene, and looked at Jean Granger, who was watching her daughter with the expression of a parent who has accepted that their child exists slightly outside the normal range and has made peace with it. "Has she always been like this?" Sirius said. "Since she could talk," Jean said. "Harry too," Sirius said. He watched the two of them go back and forth over something involving rune theory and a clearly wrong passage in a third-year textbook that both of them had apparently independently identified as wrong through completely different approaches. "They're going to be terrible together." "I know," Jean said, in a tone that was 90% fond and 10% genuine concern. She looked at Sirius. "Should I be worried?" "About the case?" "Whatever is happening with whoever took him." Sirius met her eyes. "The goblins have it in hand," he said. "And Harry has it in hand, which is a stranger thing to say about a 9-year-old than it sounds." He looked back at the two children arguing about runes over a shared book. "He's been preparing for years." I don't think whatever comes next is going to surprise him. And you? Jean said, with the directness of someone who asked real questions. Sirius thought about it. I've been in Azkaban for 5 years, he said. I have a lot of catching up to do. But I'm here. He smiled, and it was rusty, but it was real. I'm here. The vault was at the end of a cart journey that Harry rode with his glamour down, no one in the vault levels to see him, and the wind in his face and the greenlit stone walls flying past in a way that was absolutely exhilarating and which he made himself observe calmly because the cart ride's physics were interesting and he wanted to understand the enchantments. Sirius watched this and made a mental note to get the boy a broom as soon as humanly possible. The Potter Vault was not the largest in Gringotts. That distinction belonged to several ancient families whose wealth had been accumulating since before the Norman conquest. But it was significant, generations of a family who had been wealthy enough to build wealth and skilled enough to keep it, and the space inside was less a room and more an archive, the gold stacked against the back wall almost incidentally beside the chests of documents, heirloom objects, magical artifacts, and the accumulated physical record of a family that had been doing important things in the wizarding world for centuries. Harry stood in the entrance and looked at it. Really looked, the way you look at something that is both abstract history and personal fact, the place where those two things collide and become something you can touch. He walked in. He picked up the top document from the nearest chest, a letter, old, written in a looping hand that he didn't recognize, addressed to my dear William, son of William, whose line will not end here, and he read the first few lines and set it back carefully. He walked to the back wall and looked at the gold. Numbers he knew. He understood the estate in the abstract. Seeing it was different. Okay. Sirius said, from the entrance. Yeah, Harry said. He turned around. He looked at the whole room, and the family it represented, and the choices and sacrifices and lives that had ended at a door in Godric's Hollow so that the gold could sit here while the heir grew up in a cupboard. He felt angry. It was a clean anger, the kind that didn't cloud anything, the kind you could use. I want this used, he said. The estate. Not just managed. I want it doing something. He looked at Sirius. After we're through with the case. After everything that needs to happen has happened. I want the Potter name associated with things that matter. He looked at the chests of documents. What were my parents working on? Before they died. Do you know? Sirius was quiet for a moment. Your mum was doing research on protection magic. Advanced stuff, the kind that could be embedded in locations, in people, long term. She had a theory about love as a quantifiable magical force, which sounds mad when you say it out loud, but Lily could make anything sound like rigorous theory. His voice was careful, measured over the grief. Your dad was, publicly, he was doing order work. Privately, he was working on something with the Goblin Smith clans, a project about combining wizard and goblin magical techniques. They never got to finish it. Harry looked at the vault. He thought about his mother's notes on protective magic. He thought about his father's project with the Goblin Smiths. He thought about the magic he'd been developing for 5 years, the thing that was neither purely wizard nor purely goblin but something the two traditions had been touching toward from opposite directions. I'll finish it, he said. Sirius looked at him. Not now, Harry said. But eventually. He turned to leave. Come on. We're meeting Hermione for lunch and I want to stop at the bookshop. Sirius followed him out of the vault, back into the cart, back toward the surface, the gold and the documents and the history sealed safely behind them. He thought about James, who had walked with exactly that certainty, that forward-moving quality, like the next thing was always slightly more interesting than the last thing. He thought about Lily, who had been the one to make certain the next thing was worth being interested in. He thought, they would have been so proud. He kept it to himself, because Harry didn't need it said to know it, and Sirius had learned in 5 years of darkness that some things were more powerful kept in the chest, like coals rather than flames, longer burning, more sustaining. He got in the cart. They rode back up together, toward the light. Dumbledore's 15th letter arrived 3 days after the Diagon Alley visit. It was shorter than the others and its tone was different, still controlled, still impeccably civil, but the warmth was thinner now, more surface, less architecture. Underneath it, if you read carefully, was the shape of a man recalibrating. He'd heard that Sirius was out. He'd heard, through which channel exactly, Sharpax was investigating, that Harry had been in Diagon Alley. He wrote that he was relieved Harry was well and that he hoped they might soon have the opportunity to discuss, personally, the best path forward for Harry's education and future. Harry read the letter at Ragnar's desk, having been handed it as the person it was fundamentally about. He read it twice. He set it down. "He knows we're moving," he said. "Yes," Ragnar said. "He's recalibrating." He thought this was going to stay quiet, a Goblin institution filing inconvenient legal claims, something he could manage through ministry pressure and public narrative. He didn't expect Sirius. He didn't expect the vault visit. He definitely didn't expect me to be out in public. Harry tapped the letter. He's trying to decide if the approach is still viable. What approach? Ragnar said, watching him. The long game. The manage everything from a distance approach. Harry looked up. He wants a meeting. He'll push for it. He'll escalate through proxies until someone in the ministry feels obligated to force the issue, or he'll find a lever with the Wisengamot, or he'll go to the press in a way that generates enough public sentiment that Gringotts looks unreasonable for refusing. He looked at the letter again. He's going to try to meet me. Before we're ready. How do you want to handle it? Ragnar said. He asked the question the way he always asked Harry's opinion, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine inquiry. Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about the 4-year-old in the cupboard. He thought about the runic calculations on the training hall wall and the 5 years of Boneseeker's notes and the vault and Sirius's laugh and Hermione arguing with a textbook. Let him try, Harry said. We're not hiding. We've never hidden. He slid the letter back across the desk. Right back. Tell him Harry Potter is in excellent health, is receiving a comprehensive education, and looks forward to attending Hogwarts at the appropriate time. He stood up. And tell him that if he has concerns about the case Gringotts is building, he's welcome to provide his own account of the events of November 1st, 1981, to our legal department. In writing. Under oath. Ragnar looked at the letter. He looked at Harry. He picked up his quill. That, he said, will require a response. Yes, Harry said. It will. He headed for the door. I'll be in the training hall. Tell me what he says. He walked out. Ragnar heard his footsteps in the corridor, that particular rhythm, unhurried and absolute, and he thought about the first morning, about the small boy in the 2 big shoes asking, "Are you going to take me somewhere else?" with those green eyes calculating the answer before it was given. He dipped the quill. He began to write. Chapter 4, Diagon Alley. Dumbledore did not respond to the letter for 11 days. Griphook knew, because he was watching the timeline with the focused attention of someone who understood that the shape of a response told you as much as its content. 11 days was not the delay of a busy man. It was the delay of someone doing research, checking sources, consulting people he trusted, building a picture of a situation he thought he understood and was now revising. 11 days meant Dumbledore had been surprised. Not panicked, not wrong-footed, someone like Dumbledore didn't panic, but genuinely surprised, which in its own way was more interesting. When the response came it was 3 pages, measured and precise, and it did not address the invitation to provide an account of November 1st, 1981 to Gringotts Legal. It moved past that with the practiced fluidity of a man who had spent decades not answering the questions that mattered by answering adjacent questions at great length. What it did say, embedded in the second page between 2 paragraphs about Harry's educational prospects and the importance of wizarding community for a child's development, was this: I would very much like the opportunity to speak with Harry directly. I believe that many of the concerns currently animating Gringotts' position would be significantly addressed by a frank conversation between himself and myself, without intermediaries. Harry read that line 3 times. Then he looked at Sirius, who was reading over his shoulder. "He wants to talk to me alone," Harry said. "He wants to talk to you without witnesses and without anyone who can put what's said into a legal record," Sirius said, with a flatness that 5 years in Azkaban had honed to something very precise. "And he thinks that's a reasonable request to make." "He thinks I'm still manageable," Harry said. "He's updated his picture of the situation, but he hasn't updated his picture of me." He set the letter down. "He still thinks I'm a child who can be talked around." "You are a child," Sirius said. "I'm 9 and I've been studying this case for 2 years and I can disassemble a loyalty compulsion matrix in my sleep." Harry glanced at him. "Metaphorically. You could probably do it literally," Sirius muttered. Harry handed the letter back to Griphook. "No meeting." "Not yet, not alone, not on his terms." He thought for a moment. "Actually, tell him I'm looking forward to meeting him at Hogwarts. When I start. 2 years from now." Griphook looked at him. "You want to make him wait 2 years?" "I want him to understand that his timeline is not my timeline," Harry said. "He placed me in a cupboard and expected me to emerge when he opened the door. He needs to understand that's not how this works anymore." He picked up the book he'd been reading before the letter arrived. 2 years. Griphook took the letter. He walked back to his office with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has spent 5 years working towards something and can feel it acquiring the weight of inevitability. The next 2 years were not quiet. They were the opposite of quiet in ways that Ragnarok had anticipated and planned for and that still occasionally required the kind of rapid adaptation that tested even his considerable institutional reflexes. 3 things happened in quick succession that changed the shape of the situation. The first was the Daily Prophet. A journalist named Rita Skeeter published a piece. It ran on the front page, because Rita Skeeter's pieces always ran on the front page, because she wrote them to do exactly that, titled Gringotts and the Boy Who Lived, What is Britain's Most Famous Bank Hiding? It was a masterpiece of implication, nothing definitively false, nothing that could be sued over, everything arranged to produce a single reading in the mind of anyone who encountered it. That reading was, Gringotts had seized Harry Potter from his rightful guardians and was concealing him for their own financial benefit, and the wizarding public deserved answers. Harry read it over breakfast and said, "She's good. She's being fed," Sirius said, with the flat certainty of someone who had been on the wrong end of a narrative. "Dumbledore gave her the angle," Harry said. "But not the facts. He doesn't want the facts in the Prophet any more than we do, not yet. He gave her the emotional frame. The worried public figure angle. The missing child." He folded the paper. "We need to respond." Carefully, Ragnarok said, from the other end of the table. Publicly, Harry said. "Not carefully. Carefully is how you look like you have something to hide." He looked at Ragnarok. "I want to make a statement. Gringotts, on behalf of the account holder, confirming that Harry Potter is alive and well and under no duress, that his presence at the bank is voluntary and legally protected, and that any suggestion otherwise is factually incorrect." He paused. "We don't address the why. Just the what. And we do it in a press release with the full Gringotts seal, because a press release from Gringotts has a different weight than a quote." Ragnarok looked at Goldtooth. Goldtooth looked at the paper. "It's the right move," Goldtooth said. "The longer we're silent, the more the narrative sets." "Draft it this morning," Ragnarok said. He looked at Harry. "You're not named personally in this press release." "I know," Harry said. "Just account holder. Keep my name out of their mouth for as long as possible." He stood up. "I'll be in the training hall. Tell me when the draft is ready." The press release went out that afternoon. It was 4 sentences long and entirely unemotional, and its effect on the wizarding public was roughly what you'd expect from 4 sentences on official Gringotts letterhead. It didn't stop the speculation, but it reframed it. Gringotts had spoken. The institutional weight of that redirected the narrative from missing child to legally protected individual, which was a different story with different implications. Skeeter published a follow-up 3 days later that tried to crack the reframing. Harry read it and identified 3 errors of fact, 2 logical gaps, and 1 sentence that, if it ever went in front of a Wisengamot committee, would be provably untrue. He wrote them all down and gave the list to Goldtooth, who filed it under potential future use. The second thing was Hermione. She had been accepted to Hogwarts. Her letter arrived. She wrote to Harry about it immediately, with an enthusiasm that was somewhat undermined by the extremely organized nature of her response to the enthusiasm, and in the meantime she had been visiting Gringotts approximately every 3 weeks, ostensibly to continue the magical theory discussions that had started in her mother's apothecary but in practice to do the thing that she and Harry had both silently acknowledged was the actual point, which was to be in a place where both of them could think out loud at full speed without anyone asking them to slow down. Jean Granger drove her to Charing Cross and she came through the leaky cauldron and walked the alley to the bank with the confidence of someone who had done this enough times to have opinions about the most efficient route, and she always brought something, a book, a question, an argument, once a self-enchanted quill that she'd been modifying and wanted Harry's opinion on from a theoretical standpoint. Today she arrived with a folded newspaper and the expression she wore when she had identified a problem and solved it and was waiting for someone to ask. Harry looked up from his rune work. The Skeeter piece. The secondary source citations, she said, sitting down across from him and spreading the paper out. Look at this paragraph, she references an unnamed source within Gringotts. But the details she has are wrong in a specific way. She pointed. She says you were brought to the bank through the Diagon Alley entrance. You weren't, were you? You came through a secondary entrance. How do you know there's a secondary entrance? There are 6, she said, with the tone of someone who had read the architectural history of the building. I found 3 references to them across 4 different texts. Standard practice for high-security financial institutions in medieval magical construction. She tapped the paper. Her source doesn't have real inside information. They have enough to sound credible but the details are wrong. Which means they're either lying to her or she's misrepresenting someone who knows less than they're claiming. Harry looked at the paragraph. You're right, he said. Tell Ragnarok. This is useful. I already wrote to Goldtooth, she said. On the way here. She should have the note by now. Harry looked at her. When did you start corresponding with Goldtooth? About 2 months ago, Hermione said. She's been answering questions about wizarding property law for a paper I'm writing. She opened her bag and produced a substantial stack of parchment. I've been building a parallel research track on the guardianship question. I think there might be a Muggle legal angle. The placement at Privet Drive was technically a Muggle household, which means UK family law also applies, and the placement was not registered with any Muggle social services authority either. Which is its own violation. Harry stared at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. That's extraordinary. Keep going. She kept going for approximately 40 minutes, walking him through her research with the rigor of someone who had decided that if she was going to do something she was going to do it properly, and Harry listened and asked questions and made notes and thought, not for the first time, about how lucky the accident of the correspondence department's sense of humor had been. You're going to be terrifying at Hogwarts, he said, when she paused. I know, she said, without false modesty. You'll be worse. Probably, he agreed. Are you nervous? She asked. About going? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I'm curious. It's going to be complicated. There are people there who are going to have very fixed ideas about who I am and what I'm supposed to be. But complicated isn't the same as frightening. He looked at his runic notes. I've been preparing for years. I know more theory than most 7th years. I know the political landscape better than most adults. I know exactly what was done to me and by whom. He paused. I'm not walking into Hogwarts blind. I'm walking in knowing more than anyone expects me to know. That's the opposite of frightening. Hermione looked at him with the steady assessment she brought to everything. And Dumbledore? He'll be there. Yes, Harry said. He will. And you're not. No, Harry said simply. She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisive quality of someone closing a case file. All right. Then tell me about the fourth progression in this rune sequence because I've been looking at it for a week and I think there's an error. They argued about the rune sequence for 2 hours. They were both right in different ways and eventually arrived at a synthesis that was better than either starting position, which was generally how their arguments went, and which was the reason Harry considered them a feature rather than something to be resolved. The third thing was Quirinus Quirrell. He appeared in Griphook's case research the way a lot of things appeared in Griphook's case research, as a pattern that didn't fit. A defense against the dark arts professorship that had turned over with suspicious regularity. A gap in the employment records. A trip to Albania that one of Sharpak's foreign desk contacts had flagged as part of a separate intelligence file on dark wizard activity in Eastern Europe. Griphook had been pulling files on everyone connected to Hogwarts who might be relevant to the larger picture, and Quirrell's file had a quality that nagged. He brought it to Harry, which he'd taken to doing when something was pattern-shaped but not yet conclusion-shaped, because Harry's pattern recognition operated faster than most and at a different angle. Harry read the file in 20 minutes. He looked up with the particular stillness he showed when something had resolved. He went to Albania looking for something, Harry said. And he found it. That's a significant inference from a gap in employment records, Griphook said. The gap is in the right place, Harry said. Albania is where we know Voldemort's remnant is currently located. There have been 3 separate sightings in the last 2 years that Sharpak's flagged from the Foreign Intelligence Network. Quirrell goes to Albania, comes back, and within 6 months Dumbledore hires him for defense against the dark arts. He turned the file over. What does Dumbledore get from hiring someone who's just come back from wherever Voldemort's remnant is? Griphook thought about it. Information, he said. Or bait. Or both, Harry said. Put someone close to Voldemort's remnant in the school. See what happens. He set the file down. What year is Quirrell starting? The coming September, Griphook said. The same year as your year. Harry looked at him. I want everything on this. I'll pull it, Griphook said. And I want Boneseeker to brief me on what Voldemort's current state would actually look like, Harry said. Physically, magically. If the remnant found a host, what would it look like? What would it feel like to be near it? He stood up. I'm not walking into that school blind on this either. You think he's already attached to Quirrell, Griphook said. I think someone who is incorporeal and driven by nothing but the desire to return to a body would not pass up a person who came looking for him, Harry said. And I think Dumbledore knows, or suspects, and has his own plan for what to do about it, a plan I bet involves me, in a role I haven't been given the chance to agree to. He looked at the training hall wall, at the runic calculations and the months of work they represented. He's been planning something with the stone, the Philosopher's Stone, which Gringotts moved from Vault 613 to Hogwarts approximately 4 months ago, which Goldtooth found in the Vault movement records and which I've been sitting on because I wasn't sure what it meant yet. Griphook stared at him. You've known about the stone? For 6 weeks, Harry said. I was waiting until I had the full picture before I brought it to Ragnarok. He looked at Griphook's expression. Don't look at me like that. I was being thorough. You were 9 months old the last time someone described you as thorough and they meant it as a concern, Griphook said. Write that down, Harry said. It's funny. He walked to the door. Set up a meeting with Ragnarok for this afternoon. And tell Boneseeker I need the Voldemort physical manifestation briefing as soon as she can manage it. He paused. And tell Sirius, what? Griphook said. Tell him I need broom lessons to actually start. I want to be competent before September. He left. Griphook sat with the Quirrell file for a moment, thinking about the shape of what Harry had just described, the stone, Quirrell, Voldemort's remnant, Dumbledore's plan, all of it converging on a single school year, and then he opened his notebook and began a new section. He titled it, Year 1. The meeting with Ragnarok was in the afternoon, and Harry laid out everything he had on the Quirrell situation and the Philosopher's Stone with the organized precision of someone who had been rehearsing the presentation, not the words, but the sequence, the logical chain, since Griphook's office. Ragnarok listened. His expression did not change during the presentation, which was either good or bad. With Ragnarok, the absence of expression was its own data. When Harry finished, Ragnarok said, "You should have brought the stone to me 6 weeks ago." "I know," Harry said. "I wanted more first." "This is not a solo investigation," Ragnarok said. "I know," Harry said again. "But the approach I'm used to here is the same, more information before conclusions." "I was still building." Ragnarok looked at him for a moment. It was the look that contained the awareness of Harry's age, not condescension, never condescension, just the acknowledgement that 9 years old was 9 years old regardless of what else was also true. "Going forward," Ragnarok said, "flag it immediately and build the conclusion together." "Agreed?" "Agreed," Harry said. "On the stone itself," Ragnarok said. "The vault transfer was technically proper. Dumbledore is a co-signatory on the Flamel account under a very old treaty arrangement. The transfer to Hogwarts is unusual but not technically illegal." He tapped the table. "What concerns me is the purpose." "He's setting a trap," Harry said. "Something Voldemort, or Quirrell with Voldemort attached, would try to get to. And whatever he's planning as the response to that attempt, I'd guess involves a certain student who survived Voldemort's curse once." "Himself as protector," Ragnarok said. "Or the student as the solution." "Both, probably," Harry said. "He's good at arrangements where one action serves multiple purposes." Goldtooth, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, said, "If we remove Harry from the equation, if he simply doesn't go to Hogwarts this year, or goes but under circumstances that make him unavailable for Dumbledore's purposes, what happens to the trap?" "Voldemort still tries for the stone," Harry said immediately. "Or something else. His goal isn't me. His goal is a body and power. The stone is one path to that." He looked at her. "Not going isn't the answer. Going and being prepared is the answer." "Going and being prepared," Sirius said, from his chair in the corner where he'd been quiet until now, "means going with more than theoretical preparation. It means going with me." "You can't come to Hogwarts," Harry said. "No," Sirius said. "But Hogsmeade is 3 miles from Hogwarts and I have a dog animagus form and absolutely no competing obligations." He met Harry's eyes. "I'm not sitting in a flat in London while you walk into a school with a possessed professor and whatever Dumbledore has constructed." Harry looked at him. He could see Sirius's position clearly, the 5 years of Azkaban, the lost James and Lily, the 5 years watching Harry from close range and knowing what was at stake, and he thought about the conversation in the vault, about the grip of Sirius's hand across the table. About what it meant to have someone who showed what they were with what they did. "Hogsmeade," Harry said. "Close enough to reach quickly." "I'll register at the 3 Broomsticks," Sirius said. "Very boring life. Nothing to see." "You're terrible at subtle," Harry said. "I'm excellent at fast," Sirius said. "Which is what will actually be relevant." Harry conceded this with a slight tilt of his head. He looked at Ragnarok. "On the case, September is 2 months out. What's our status?" "The case is ready to file," Goldtooth said. 420 pages. The resonance signature sample. The scan records. The financial audit. The will. The black imprisonment record. The guardianship placement documentation. The rune removal records. She paused. "We've been waiting for the right moment. The right venue." She looked at Harry. A child entering Hogwarts, publicly, for the first time, that is a moment. That is a venue. The Wisengamot hears it when I arrive, Harry said. Within the same week, Goldtooth said. We file, we inform the press simultaneously, and we provide enough documentation that no one can sit on it. The Ministry cannot ignore a Wisengamot filing. And by the time Dumbledore can mount a response, the filing is public record. Harry sat with that. He thought about the 11-day delay before the last letter. About the careful management. About every move that had been made to keep the narrative controlled. He's going to try to get to me before I get to Hogwarts, Harry said. When he hears about the filing. He'll want to talk to me. In person. Before I go. Almost certainly, Ragnarok said. Then we file, Harry said. We file in the same week the Hogwarts letter arrives. We give him no window. He looked around the table. And when I get on that train, I'm not hiding. I'm not using a glamour. I'm Harry Potter and I've been somewhere doing something that was mine to do, and anyone who has questions about that is welcome to ask them directly. He pushed back his chair. 2 months. Let's make sure everything is in order. He stood. The people around the table looked at him, Ragnarok, Goldtooth, Sirius, Griphook, Sharpaxe, Ironforge, and there was a quality to the silence that wasn't quite ceremony but wasn't nothing either. The weight of 5 years arriving at the place they'd been building toward. Well, Sirius said, into that silence, let's go break something, then. The broom lessons happened in a long field south of London that Sirius had tracked down through a contact of a contact, a stretch of unremarkable countryside under permanent notice-me-not charms maintained by a family of squibs who rented the field to wizards for exactly this purpose and charged a surprisingly reasonable rate. Sirius had arrived with 2 brooms, his own Nimbus, maintained through 5 years in Azkaban by the single application of preserving charms that had been the last thing he'd done before his arrest, and a newer Comet 260 for Harry, and the expression of someone who has been looking forward to something for years. Harry stood in the field with the comet in his hand and looked at the sky. It was a clear day, the kind of late summer day that felt generous, wide blue with the particular quality of light that came in the hour before afternoon became evening. The field smelled of cut grass and possibility. You've never been on a broom, Sirius said. I've hovered, Harry said. Wandlessly. 6 feet once. That is not the same as flying, Sirius said, with the certainty of a man for whom flying was something close to religion. I know, Harry said. Show me. Sirius showed him. He walked through it, how to mount, how to balance, how to lean into direction changes rather than pulling against them, how the broom was responding to intent as much as physical weight, which was why wizards flew better than muggles could even in theory. He was a good teacher because he loved the subject enough to take the basics seriously and because he understood that Harry's particular relationship with magic meant that some standard explanations needed adjusting. Harry listened to all of it. Then he kicked off. He was wobbly for approximately the first 30 seconds, which was honest. The broom's responsiveness was different from wandless hovering, more partnered, requiring a different calibration of intent. He adjusted in real time, moving through the corrections with the fluency of someone whose relationship with his own magic was precise enough that the adjustments cost nothing. By the end of the first minute he was 20 feet up and stable. By the end of the first 5 minutes he was doing turns. Sirius, hovering on his Nimbus with the expression of someone watching something that was both impressive and mildly unfair, said, "You're joking." "I told you I hover well," Harry called across. "Hovering is not," Sirius dove after him, because Harry had accelerated out of the turn, and for the next hour they flew, and it was the most purely uncomplicated thing that had happened in a very long time. Harry flew fast and found it clarifying in the same way that the anger in the vault had been clarifying, the way speed stripped everything down to the essentials. Just the air and the movement and the ground below and the sky above, and nothing in between that required navigation or strategy or patience. He pulled up into a steep climb, held it until the momentum went near vertical, and then tipped over the top and came out of the drop into a long controlled arc that would have made Sirius's hair go white if it had been less technically precise. It was technically very precise. Where, Sirius said, when Harry came back to hover beside him, did you learn to do that? I just figured it out, Harry said. That was a Wronski feint, Sirius said. You just invented the Wronski feint. It has a name. It's a famous Quidditch maneuver. Victor Crumb, never mind, Crumb is 10, he hasn't done it yet. The point is that was a Wronski feint on your first day on a broom and I need you to know how annoying that is. Harry grinned. It was wide and genuine and it was Lily Potter's smile on James Potter's face with 5 years of Gringotts education behind it, and Sirius looked at it and thought that if Azkaban had taken nothing else from him, at least he had this exact moment, in a field south of London, with the sky going gold and this boy who had become himself laughing in midair. He dove at Harry and Harry dodged left on pure instinct, and they spent another 40 minutes doing nothing in particular except flying. The Hogwarts letter arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed, in the usual way, to Mr. H. Potter, but unlike the letters that had presumably been sent to Privet Drive for 5 years and been returned undelivered, this one had been delivered directly to Gringotts, which had a standing arrangement with the Hogwarts Owl Post for account holders in residence. The owl landed on Harry's breakfast table, was thanked with a piece of toast, and departed. Harry opened the letter, read it, set it down, and picked up his tea. Well? Griphook said. It's the standard letter, Harry said. Book list, supply list, platform information. He picked it up again and read the supply list. Some of this is wrong. How so? The standard book of spells, Grade 1, is outdated. There are 3 better introductory texts published in the last decade. The potion supply list is missing 3 ingredients that current potions theory suggests should be standard. He set it down. I'll get what they ask for and what I actually need. Madame Malkin's for the robes and Flourish and Blots for the books. You're going back to Diagon Alley, Griphook said. Today, Harry said. Before the filing is public. After today, going to the alley will be an event. He finished his tea. I'll be quick. It was not quick, because Diagon Alley did not permit quick when you were also meeting Hermione Granger who had arrived independently with her own supply list and her own additional purchases and approximately 45 minutes of conversation stored up since their last meeting. They moved through the alley side by side, Harry without glamour this time, because there was no point, the filing was going in tomorrow and the day after that the question of visibility would be permanently moot, and no one recognized him for the first 20 minutes, which was about as long as it lasted. It was a woman in Flourish and Blots who recognized him first. She was middle-aged, pleasant-faced, holding a copy of A History of Magic in one hand, and she looked up from the shelf and looked at Harry and her face did the thing faces did when recognition arrived late. She said. You're Harry Potter. Harry looked at her. Yes, he said. She stared for a moment. You're alive. They said, the paper, I'm alive, he said. I've been well. I apologize for the confusion. He picked up the copy of Magical Theory he'd been looking for and moved toward the register. The woman watched him go. Then she looked at the young girl beside him, who was also picking up books with focused efficiency, and looked back at Harry, and looked around the shop as if seeking confirmation that this was happening. Harry paid for his books. He said goodbye to Hermione at the shop door, she was staying another hour, she had a list, and walked back toward the bank entrance with Sirius at his shoulder and his bags in his hand and the early evening quiet of the alley around them. That's going to be the whole wizarding world by tomorrow, Sirius said. I know, Harry said. And the day after that, the filing. Yes. Sirius looked at him sideways. How do you feel? Harry walked for a moment. The alley was its usual evening self, the shopkeepers pulling in their displays, the last few customers moving toward the leaky cauldron, the sky above the narrow street going purple at the edges. He thought about the woman's face when she'd recognized him. Not the celebrity recognition, but what was underneath it, the relief, the genuine warm human relief of something that was supposed to be safe turning out to actually be safe. The wizarding world thought of him as theirs in a way that should have been complicated but mostly wasn't. They needed him, not the way Dumbledore needed him, which was as a piece in a game, but in the way that people needed the things they'd staked their sense of safety on. He was a symbol. He'd been a symbol since he was a year old. He couldn't undo that. What he could do was make sure the symbol stood for something real. "Ready," he said. "I feel ready." Sirius looked at him for a moment longer. "Yeah," he said. "I think you are." They walked back to Gringotts through the evening alley, and behind them the witch from the bookshop was already telling her friend what she'd seen, and the friend was already writing to her sister, and by morning it would be a dozen conversations, and by the afternoon it would be more, and the filing was going in at 9 and the press release alongside it, and the world was about to find out that Harry Potter had been doing something with his 5 years, and the shape of the thing he'd been doing was about to become visible. Harry ate dinner and went to the training hall. He ran the runic sequences. He practiced control, as he did every night, the deliberate gathering and release, the precision work, the advanced theoretical applications he'd been building toward for the better part of 2 years. The green light moved through the hall with purpose, structured and clean, the magic of a person who knew exactly what it was and what it was for. At some point Bone Seeker appeared in the doorway with her notebook. She watched for a while without speaking. He was aware of her but didn't stop. When he finally lowered his hands, she said, "That last sequence. The nested resonance pattern." "I know," he said. "It's not in any text." "No," she said. "I checked." She made a note. "You developed it yourself?" From the theoretical foundation in the Goblin fourth form texts, extrapolated through the rune theory Scratchclaw's been teaching. It's a natural extension if you assume the resonance principles apply at higher orders. He looked at his hands. "It works as a diagnostic tool. I can use it to identify foreign magical signatures inside a person's aura without physical contact." Bone Seeker looked up from her notebook. "In case," Harry said simply, "I meet someone at Hogwarts who isn't what they appear to be." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote it down. Outside, London moved through its night, entirely unaware of the 9-year-old in the basement of a bank who was quietly making sure that the beginning of his life, the real beginning, the one he got to choose, was going to be the most prepared beginning in the history of a very long conflict. In Hogsmeade, 3 miles from Hogwarts, the 3 broomsticks had a new resident who had registered under a name that was not quite false and paid in cash and sat by the window in the evenings with a pint and a view of the Northern Road, and would know when it was time. In Hogwarts, a man with a turban went about his business. He taught badly. He flinched from garlic. He had a face that looked at everything with hunger that wasn't his own, and eyes that had been dark before they became something else. In Albania, the last thread of what had once been powerful and terrible and was now merely terrible stretched toward the fragment of itself that sat in Gringotts' deepest vault, found nothing, and receded. The summer ended. September came. Chapter 5, The letter. The filing hit the wizarding world like a stone through glass. Goldtooth had timed it to the minute. 9 in the morning, the Wisingamot clerk's office opened, and the 422-page case document was delivered by 6 goblin couriers simultaneously to 6 different recipients: the Wisingamot clerk, the Minister for Magic, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the editor of the Daily Prophet, the editor of Witch Weekly, and the international correspondent of the French magical press, who had been pre-briefed and was already writing. The press release went to 27 journalists at 9:01. By 9:15, the Wisingamot clerk had sent an emergency notification to all sitting members. By 9:30, the minister's office had sent 3 increasingly urgent owls to Gringotts that Ragnarok declined to acknowledge before noon as a matter of principle. By 10, the Daily Prophet's newsroom was apparently in a state that their junior editor would later describe in her memoirs as productive chaos, which translated to, everyone was trying to read the summary simultaneously and no one had yet decided whether this was the biggest story of the decade or an institutional hoax. It was not a hoax. The summary alone was 40 pages. It outlined, in the dry and immovable language of Goblin legal documentation, the following: the false scan record of November 1981, the illegal guardianship placement, the compulsion and suppression enchantments found on a minor, their magical signature, the soul fragment and its removal, the suppression of the Potter will, the imprisonment without trial of Sirius Black, the financial irregularities in the Potter estate, and the totality of what had been built against the heir of the Potter family by a person whose name appeared, in the summary alone, 47 times. Albus Dumbledore. Harry was in the training hall when Griphook came to tell him it was done. He was in the middle of the nested resonance sequence. He held the last beat of it, let it complete, and released. Any immediate response from him? Harry said. Not yet, Griphook said. His name has been in the prophet's hands for 20 minutes. I'd expect something within the hour. Not from Dumbledore directly, Harry said, picking up his notebook. He'll go through someone he trusts first. Minerva McGonagall, probably, or one of the Wizengamot members he's close to. He'll want to know the scope before he commits to a position. He looked at Griphook. What time does the Hogwarts Express leave? 11 o'clock from King's Cross, Griphook said. Platform 9 3/4. Right. Harry looked at the wall. 2 hours. He pulled his trunk from the corner, already packed, had been packed for 3 days, and shouldered his bag. Tell Ragnarok I'll write when I'm settled. He knows, Griphook said. He also says, if anything significant develops, I'll handle it, Harry said. And then I'll write. Griphook looked at him for a long moment, the 9-year-old who had walked into the bank in 2 big shoes and fallen asleep in the scanning chair, the person who was walking out now, and felt, unexpectedly, something that he didn't have a clean goblin word for. The closest human equivalent might have been pride, but it sat in his chest with more weight than that, like something that had been earned slowly over 5 years and couldn't be summarized. Harry, he said. Harry stopped. The letter, Griphook said. The one that started this. You guessed it was me. Harry looked at him. I was right, wasn't I? A pause. Griphook had never confirmed it, not in 5 years, not once. He'd maintained the institutional fiction of not knowing, had been consistent about it, had filed the question under interesting and left it there. The magic on the parchment, Griphook said. When I found it. It was old. Intent-based. It felt like something that wanted to be found. And? Harry said. And, Griphook said, the morning I found it, I had been sitting at my desk for 2 hours looking at the discrepancy in the scan records and thinking about a small boy somewhere who probably didn't know what was in him or what had been done to him, and I had a very strong feeling that someone needed to do something about it, and I didn't know who. He paused. Then the letter was there. Harry looked at him steadily. You think the magic produced the letter? I think, Griphook said carefully, that intent-based old magic responds to genuine need in ways that don't always have a clean explanation. I think you have a mother who embedded protection magic so advanced that Boneseeker still uses it as a reference case. And I think she loved you very much. Harry was quiet. He looked at the floor. Then he looked up, and whatever was on his face was not public Harry, not strategy Harry, not prepared and ready Harry. It was something younger and more complicated and entirely real. Yeah, he said. His voice was level. I think so too. He picked up his trunk. He walked out. Griphook stood in the empty training hall and looked at the runic calculations on the wall, months of work, layers of theory, the physical record of a mind that had been doing something extraordinary in a basement for 5 years, and thought about Lily Potter's protection magic, about intent finding its way to the people who needed it, about the particular shape of a debt that couldn't be calculated because it predated the existence of any ledger. He picked up his notebook. He wrote, case filed. Subject en route to Hogwarts. He paused. Added, she would have been proud. Then he closed the notebook and went to monitor the ministry's response. King's Cross was the ordinary catastrophe of a busy London morning, commuters and waves, coffee cups and briefcases, the particular compressed energy of a city getting itself from one place to another. Harry moved through it with Sirius, both of them carrying the visual weight of two people who were traveling and nothing else, unremarkable in the Muggle crowd. Until they hit the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. "You first," Sirius said. Harry looked at the barrier. He walked through it at a normal pace with no particular ceremony because it was a wall with a charm on it and he'd read the Muggle-repelling enchantment specification last year out of curiosity and understood exactly how it worked. The magic parted for him the way it always did, not like something yielding to pressure but like something recognizing what it was supposed to do. Platform 9 3/4 was full. It shouldn't have been a surprise, 11 o'clock departure, families coming from all over Britain, the last day of August, but the compressed aliveness of the platform was its own thing, the owls and the cats and the trunks and the students in groups, the particular emotion of first years who were trying to look like they weren't terrified, the older students who were catching up across a summer, the parents who were performing casualness over a great deal of feeling. Harry stood for a moment and let himself just be in it. He'd read about this. He'd known intellectually what it was. But the smell of the steam and the particular noise of 100 different conversations and the scarlet gleaming engine at the platform's end were the kind of thing that only existed at full resolution in reality, and he wanted a moment before the next thing started. Then a second-year girl dropped a cage containing a very agitated owl approximately 6 inches from his foot, looked up in apology, and went completely still. "You're Harry Potter," she said. The platform, in that immediate radius, went briefly quieter. Harry looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Can I help you with that?" He bent and picked up the cage. The owl inside, a barn owl with strong opinions, clicked its beak at him and then subsided, which was frankly remarkable. Thank you," the girl said, in the voice of someone whose brain had split between recognizing a celebrity and processing that the celebrity was handing back her owl. "Nice owl," Harry said, which was not strictly an observation about the owl's aesthetic qualities but rather about the barn owl's markings, which were unusual and suggested a line bred for long distance rather than speed, which was an interesting choice. He handed the cage back and moved toward the train. The quiet that had radiated outward from the moment of recognition did not fully reassemble itself before he was on the train, and the last thing he heard on the platform was the girl saying something to her companion in an urgent undertone that ended with the filing. Today of all days, he found a compartment near the back of the train, stowed his trunk in the overhead rack, sat down by the window, and looked out at the platform where Sirius was saying something to a cluster of parents who had definitely recognized him, navigating it with the particular ease of a man who had been famous before Azkaban and had come back from Azkaban and had decided that the opinions of people who thought Azkaban defined him were not worth organizing his behavior around. Harry watched the platform through the glass. Families. Children. The compression of ordinary life around a very specific annual ritual. He looked at first-year students who didn't know yet what they were about to become, who were carrying their fear and excitement without the benefit of 5 years of deliberate preparation, and he thought about how different that was from his own position and whether that difference was an advantage or just a different kind of alone. The compartment door slid open. "Is anyone sitting here?" Hermione said, looking in with her trunk already being levitated by controlled wand work which was, technically, magic before Hogwarts, which was technically against ministry regulations for underage wizards, and which she was doing with the complete confidence of someone who had decided the regulation was unreasonable and the ministry was welcome to write to her about it. Harry looked at the levitated trunk. "You're going to have a record with the improper use of magic office before we even arrive. The regulation only applies if a Muggle witnesses it," she said, which was entirely true and which Harry suspected she had checked in detail. She brought the trunk in and sat across from him. She had a book already open. "Have you seen the prophet this morning?" "I caused the prophet this morning," Harry said. She looked up. "The filing?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, the assessment that preceded everything with Hermione, and then she said, "How did it feel when it went?" He thought about it. "Like putting something down that you've been carrying for a long time," he said. "You don't notice the weight until you set it down." She nodded. She went back to her book. They sat in comfortable silence as the platform outside filled further and the train's departure crept closer. 2 first-years put their heads into the compartment, a boy with freckles and a nose that suggested a family that had seen a lot of Quidditch accidents, and a smaller boy with a round face who looked genuinely uncertain about everything, and asked if the seats were taken. Harry said no. They came in. The freckled boy's eyes went to Harry's scar about 30 seconds after he sat down. He stopped. Started again. Ron Weasley, he said, with the slightly formal introduction of someone who had been told by his mother that introductions were important. And this is Neville Longbottom. Harry Potter, Harry said. Hermione Granger. Hermione looked up briefly from her book to say hello, determined that Ron Weasley was not an immediate threat to linear thinking, and went back to reading. Ron looked between them. I read about, the paper this morning. He stopped, visibly recalibrating. He was the kind of person who defaulted to enthusiasm and was currently fighting it into something more appropriate. My dad works at the ministry, he said. He came home at breakfast just to tell us. I've never seen him look like that. What did he look like? Harry said, with genuine curiosity. Like something that had been a bit wrong for a long time had just been named, Ron said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself for having said something that precise. Neville, who had been quiet with the watchful quality of someone who processed before he spoke, said, My Gran cried. When the owl came. She doesn't cry. He looked at Harry with large, earnest eyes. She said your parents were, she knew them. She said they were very good people. Harry felt the particular weight of that, the people who remembered James and Lily as people, who had known them in the ordinary way, who carried versions of them that weren't defined by the night they died. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it fully. Tell her I'm glad they had people who thought well of them. Neville nodded seriously. This exchange seemed to settle something for him, and he produced a small toad from his pocket that he held in both hands with the intensity of a child determined not to lose something important, and the atmosphere in the compartment organized itself into something functional. The train lurched. The platform began to slide past the window. Harry watched King's Cross fall away and the London suburbs begin, the backs of ordinary houses, gardens, the ordinary infrastructure of a world that ran parallel to the Wizarding one and mostly didn't know it, and felt the specific quality of a threshold being crossed. Right, Ron said, after approximately 40 seconds of silence, with the energy of someone who was constitutionally unable to sustain silence. So, Hogwarts. What house do you think you'll be in? The sorting was held at 7 in the evening, and Harry had been in the castle for 2 hours by then, which was approximately enough time to form a preliminary assessment. Hogwarts was extraordinary. Not in the way photographs suggested. He'd seen photographs, architectural drawings, historical texts. The photographs couldn't carry what the actual building did, the way the magic was structural rather than applied, woven into the stone itself over 1,000 years of accumulation so that the castle didn't have enchantments on it so much as the enchantments were part of what the stone was. He could feel the whole building with the environmental awareness that had been natural since 4 years old, and the feeling of Hogwarts was vast and layered and old in ways that most things weren't. He catalogued it as they moved through the entrance hall, the magic of the moving staircases, the ambient enchantments in the great hall ceiling, the older and quieter magic in the corridors, the traces of 1,000 years of students and teachers and the ordinary accumulation of life. He filed it all. He also catalogued the turban. Quirrell was at the staff table when they entered, and Harry's resonance pattern went to work the moment he was within range, because the range of what he could read had expanded substantially over 5 years, and a possessed professor in a moderate-sized room was not a subtle signal. He didn't need to look at Quirrell for more than 3 seconds to confirm what the pattern told him. There were 2 magical signatures in Quirrell's space. One was Quirrell's own, diminished, suppressed, faintly distressed, like a candle burning very low under someone else's hand. The other was something Harry had been briefed on by Bone Seeker, something she had described from the theoretical literature and the single prior case she had encountered, and which he now recognized with cold certainty. A fragmented soul, attached. He looked away from Quirrell before the looking became noticeable. He looked at the high table systematically, reading signatures the way you'd read a room for exits, methodical and unhurried. McGonagall, sharp and precise and carrying something that resonated with old guilt, he'd read enough about her to have a theory about that, and the resonance confirmed it. Flitwick, cheerful and clean and genuinely warm. Snape, watching Harry with the particular attention of someone who has been told to pay attention, his signature dark and complex and carrying grief folded into it like a river that had changed course around a large rock. The other professors, teachers, people. And at the center of the table, flanked by all of them, Albus Dumbledore. Harry had spent 5 years building a picture of this man. From the legal files, from the resonance sample, from the letters and their subtext and the shape of every decision he had made. He'd thought he knew what he would feel when he finally saw him in person. He hadn't quite anticipated the clarity of it. Dumbledore was old, genuinely old, the kind that came from genuine years, not just the look of it, with the long silver hair and beard and the half-moon spectacles and the robes in deep blue, and he was watching Harry come in with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and managing all of them with the practiced skill of someone who had been managing expressions for a very long time. Concern. Warmth. Something that might have been relief and was positioned as such but actually had the texture of reassessment, measuring, calculating, adjusting the picture. Harry walked in with the first years, and he didn't look at Dumbledore with anything so theatrical as defiance. He looked at him the way he looked at everything, directly, steadily, without performance. For one moment, across the great hall, they looked at each other. Dumbledore's expression did something. It was small, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a barely visible adjustment in the careful architecture of his warmth, but Harry caught it, because Harry was watching for exactly that, and what it told him was this: Dumbledore had updated his picture of the situation over 5 years, through letters and legal filings and the Diagon Alley sighting, but the actual reality of Harry Potter standing in front of him was still surprising. Still more than he'd accounted for. Good. Harry looked away. He looked at McGonagall, who was holding a battered hat that looked older than most people's grandparents, and he waited his turn. The Sorting Hat talked to him for 4 seconds. It said, in the private voice it used inside a student's head, "Oh. Well, this is unusual." Harry waited. The hat said, "You could go anywhere. You know that. I don't think I've seen a case in 700 years where any of the 4 would actually be inappropriate." "I know what I am," Harry said. "Yes," the hat said. "You do, don't you?" A pause. "Gryffindor," the hat announced, which produced a roar from the Gryffindor table that was substantially larger than the roars that had greeted previous students, because everyone in the Great Hall had been reading the Prophet all day and the first year who'd walked in 5 minutes ago with James Potter's hair and Lily Potter's eyes was a name they all knew, and his sorting felt significant in a way that sortings didn't usually feel. Harry walked to the Gryffindor table and sat down between Ron Weasley, who was already there and was vibrating with something that was technically composure, and a second-year girl with kind eyes who introduced herself as Katie Bell. He looked at the high table. Dumbledore was applauding with everyone else, his expression warm, and Harry let himself see what was underneath the warmth, the recalculation, the careful attention, the shape of a man deciding how to proceed when the situation had developed in ways he hadn't controlled. He would want a meeting. He would make it happen soon, probably this week, probably framed as a welcome, as a check-in, as the warm concern of a man who had always been looking out for Harry's best interests. Harry thought, let him. He turned to Ron. "How long until the food arrives?" Ron blinked, recalibrating from whatever he'd been expecting Harry's first words at the Gryffindor table to be. "When Dumbledore says so. He does a little speech first." "I'll survive," Harry said. Hermione, who was a row down and clearly within earshot and had been sorted into Gryffindor 4 names ahead of Harry and had been waiting with visible patience for him to arrive, leaned over and said, "Did you see Quirrell?" "Yes," Harry said quietly. "And?" "Confirmed," he said, just as quietly. "We'll talk later." Hermione nodded once and pulled back, and her face was entirely ordinary for anyone watching, the face of a first year having a conversation on the first night, which was exactly right. Dumbledore's speech was everything Harry had read in the historical records, warm, full of gentle humor, slightly eccentric in ways that were carefully calibrated to produce affection rather than unease. He welcomed the first years. He made announcements. He said the name Harry Potter with a warmth that was designed to convey long-term personal investment in Harry's well-being, and the hall responded to it the way the hall was meant to, with the particular communal warmth of a community acknowledging something it cared about. Harry ate his dinner. He talked to Ron about Quidditch, because Ron knew an extraordinary amount about Quidditch and was delightful about sharing it, and Neville, who had ended up at Gryffindor also, was doing well with his toad, and the food was genuinely excellent, and Hogwarts at dinner on the first night was something in and of itself, worth being present for. At the end of the meal, as the plates cleared themselves and the students prepared to move to their dormitories, Professor McGonagall came down the length of the table with the step of a woman who has made a decision and is now executing it. She reached Harry and said, quietly, "Mr. Potter. The headmaster would like a brief word this evening, if you're willing. Nothing formal, just a welcome." The table around him had gone slightly quieter, with the pricked-up attention of people trying to look like they weren't listening. Harry looked at McGonagall. He looked at her with everything he'd learned about reading a person, the resonance, the expression, the weight of the old guilt he'd picked up earlier, the way her hands were precisely still and the way hands were when someone was working to keep them that way. "I'd be happy to," he said. "Tomorrow morning, before classes. I'd like to get settled tonight." McGonagall looked at him. He saw the moment she processed that he'd shifted the timeline without framing it as a refusal, and the smaller moment underneath that where she recognized she was being handled, not disrespectfully, but precisely, and didn't quite know what to do with that realization when it was coming from an 11-year-old. "I'll let the headmaster know," she said, after a pause that lasted exactly one beat longer than such pauses usually did. "Thank you, Professor," Harry said. He looked back at his plate. "The treacle tart was excellent, by the way. Please tell the house elves." McGonagall walked away. Ron looked at Harry with wide eyes. "Did you just tell the deputy headmistress when you were available?" "I arranged a meeting for a time that works for me," Harry said. "Same thing." Ron thought about this. "You are very strange," he said, with the tone of someone who has decided this is a positive quality. "I know," Harry said, which was James Potter's self-awareness in Lily Potter's honest delivery, and somewhere in the back of his mind something warm and distant acknowledged the inheritance. The dormitory was a round room at the top of Gryffindor Tower, 5 four-poster beds with deep red curtains, the particular smell of old stone and something herbal from the enchanted candles, windows that looked out over the grounds in the dark toward the lake and the forest. Ron immediately claimed the bed nearest the window, established a political position about socks being acceptable on the floor that Neville politely but clearly disagreed with, and the normal texture of first-night dormitory life organized itself around its usual concerns. Harry sat on his bed and looked at the ceiling for a while. The castle's magic pressed quietly around him, familiar in its depth if not its specific shape. He went through the day, systematically, the platform, the train, the sorting, the great hall, Quirrell, Dumbledore, McGonagall, cataloguing, filing, noting what needed action and what needed patience. Then he went to sleep. He dreamed, briefly and cleanly, of a woman with red hair standing in a kitchen full of light, and the dream had no plot and no narrative, it was just an image, just her, the feeling of warmth that had no specific memory attached to it because the memory belonged to a year-old baby who hadn't had the architecture to store it properly. Just the warmth. Just the sense of it. He woke at 6 and felt, as he always did, entirely ready for the next thing. Dumbledore's office was at the top of a spiraling staircase behind a gargoyle that moved aside on the password, Sherbet Lemon, which Harry knew in advance from the historical texts on Dumbledore's tenure, and was the kind of room that communicated personality with total confidence. Books on every surface. The pensieve on its cabinet. A sleeping phoenix on its perch that cracked one eye as Harry came in, assessed him, and went back to sleep in the particular way of very old things that have seen a great deal and take their time deciding what's interesting. Every wall bore some instrument, some memory, some artifact of a long life spent at the center of things. Harry moved through it with his environmental awareness doing what it always did, reading, cataloging, and found the room interesting in the way of something that told true things about a person even when the person was being very careful about what they chose to tell. Dumbledore was at his desk. He rose when Harry came in, and the warmth was there immediately, structured and deliberate and practiced enough to be genuine in its presentation even if its foundation was something else. "Harry," he said. "Please sit down. I've been looking forward to this for a very long time." "I know," Harry said, sitting. He met Dumbledore's eyes directly. "You've written 15 letters in 5 years. A beat." The warmth didn't shift. "I was concerned," Dumbledore said. "Naturally. When I found that you had left your aunt's home, when Gringotts found what had been placed inside me," Harry said, "and removed me from an illegal guardianship placement to a legally protected environment." The warmth shifted. Not much, not visibly to someone who wasn't watching for it. Just the slight adjustment in the architecture of an expression that was being managed rather than felt. "Harry," Dumbledore said, gently. "I understand that the way things were presented to you, over these years, may have created a somewhat colored impression of my actions. I would very much like the opportunity to explain my reasoning." "The reasoning is in the filing," Harry said. "All of it. Every decision and its consequences. The Wizengamot has it. The Ministry has it. 27 journalists have it." He tilted his head slightly. "Is there something in the filing that's incorrect?" A pause. "The filing presents a very particular perspective. It presents documented evidence," Harry said. "Physical evidence from the scan. The resonance sample, which bears your magical signature. The will, which you sealed under emergency authority that didn't apply to a private citizen's estate. Sirius Black's imprisonment record, which shows your recommendation to Crouch." He met Dumbledore's eyes without performance. "If any of the documentation is inaccurate, Gringotts Legal would welcome a detailed response. In writing. Under oath." The pause that followed was the longest yet. Harry sat in it without filling it, which was a skill Ragnarok had taught him. That silence was not a vacuum that required plugging. Sometimes it was the most informative thing in the room. Dumbledore looked at him. Really looked, in the way Harry recognized as genuine assessment rather than managed engagement, the real intelligence behind the warmth, the one that had made all the decisions the filing documented, trying to map the shape of what was in front of him. "You are," Dumbledore said slowly, "quite different from what I expected." "I know," Harry said. "The years at Gringotts." A gesture that encompassed something broad. "The education." "Yes. And the magic." Dumbledore's eyes moved to Harry's hands, then back to his face. "The reports from Bone Seeker, which I have not been permitted to see but which I have been told suggest something quite exceptional." "Also yes," Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Harry hadn't predicted. He sat back in his chair, and the managed warmth receded slightly, and what replaced it was something more straightforward. "Not honesty, exactly. But less theater." "You are angry with me," Dumbledore said. "No," Harry said. That surprised him. "No. I was angry," Harry said. "I processed it over 5 years. What I am now is clear." He kept his voice even, not cool, not performing anything. Just precise. "You made decisions about my life without my knowledge or consent, and those decisions were harmful, and you made them because you decided my function was more important than my personhood. I understand why. I don't agree with it, and I don't forgive it yet, but I understand it." He paused. "What I need you to understand is that function and personhood are not opposed in my case. I am going to do what I'm going to do, against Voldemort, against whatever comes, because I choose to, not because you arranged for me to have no other option. That's an important distinction." Dumbledore looked at him across the desk for a long, assessing moment. "And the fragment," Dumbledore said carefully. "Its removal. Are you aware of the implications? That a Horcrux anchor is gone and Voldemort's path to full resurrection is harder without a living vessel?" Harry said. "Yes. Bone Seeker briefed me at 7 years old. I've been studying Horcrux theory for 4 years. He met Dumbledore's eyes. He made 7. The fragment in me was 1. The diary is destroyed. I've read the file from the chamber incident, which hasn't happened yet, but the diary is a threat you've been aware of for years. The others are out there." He watched Dumbledore's face. "I know about the locket. I know about the cup. I know about the ring. Careful with that one, by the way, it's cursed beyond the Horcrux enchantment." He tilted his head. "Would you like to have that conversation properly, or would you prefer to continue the version where I'm a child you can explain things to slowly?" Dumbledore was very still. "I came here this morning," Harry said, "because I want us to be able to work together. Genuinely. Not the version where you manage me and use me and tell yourself it's for the greater good, the actual version, where we're both honest about what we know and what we're trying to do." He paused. "I'm going to find and destroy the Horcruxes. I'm going to deal with Voldemort. I am doing this because my parents died fighting him and because the world my parents wanted to live in is worth fighting for, and not for any other reason." His voice was completely steady. "You can help with that, or you can spend the next several years trying to manage something you no longer control. That's a genuine offer and a genuine choice." The office was very quiet. The Phoenix shifted on its perch. The instruments on the walls turned slowly at their various speeds, indifferent to the conversation. Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter for a long, long moment. Harry looked back. He didn't perform the look, no challenge, no defiance, no theater. Just a person being looked at and not finding it uncomfortable. "You are," Dumbledore said finally, "the most remarkable 11-year-old I have ever encountered." "I know," Harry said. "Do we have a deal?" Another pause. Something moved through Dumbledore's face, something that was genuine, that wasn't managed, that had the quality of a very old person encountering something that had been a very long time coming and was not entirely what they'd feared. "I have kept," Dumbledore said carefully, "a great many things from you that you perhaps deserved to know earlier." "Yes," Harry said. "The Horcrux situation being chief among them. Start there, if you like. Tell me what you know that I don't, and I'll do the same. And we'll see if the total is more useful than either of us has separately." Dumbledore looked at him for one final moment. Then he folded his hands on the desk and began to talk. Harry listened. He cross-referenced what he heard against what he knew, flagged 3 things he already had more accurate information on than Dumbledore did, made a mental note of the 2 things Dumbledore mentioned that were genuinely new, and thought about the shape of the conversation, the way Dumbledore was still managing even while being more honest, the way every genuine revelation was also a test, reading Harry's reaction, recalibrating. Old habits. Old man. Old certainties bending slowly under the weight of a situation they hadn't accounted for. Harry thought, it's a start. He didn't think, I trust him. He thought those were appropriately different things, and that distinguishing between them was exactly the kind of lesson that 5 years in a Goblin bank had been built around. He stayed for an hour. He left with more than he'd arrived with and gave enough in return to make the exchange genuine without surrendering anything strategic. He walked back down the spiral staircase past the gargoyle and into the corridor, where the morning had gotten properly started, students moving between dormitory and great hall, the castle's old magic turning in its deep channels around all of them. He thought about Quirrell, who had defense against the dark arts this afternoon, and about the philosopher's stone somewhere in the castle, and about Voldemort's remnant pressing against the back of a frightened man's skull, and about the Horcrux network that Dumbledore had confirmed and that Harry had been building toward for years. There was a great deal of work to do. He walked toward the great hall, where Ron had apparently saved him a seat at breakfast, which was the kind of ordinary thing that was also, in its own way, exactly what the work was for. He sat down. He poured himself tea. Ron was explaining something about the Gryffindor Quidditch team with competitive passion, and Neville was eating with focused relief, and Hermione had a book open beside her plate at an angle that suggested she was reading and listening simultaneously and was managing both effectively. Outside the castle windows, the Scottish morning came in gold and grey over the lake, over the forest, over the grounds that were old and held their own knowledge, and somewhere in a village 3 miles away a man with the look of someone rebuilding himself from scratch was having his breakfast and watching the road. Harry drank his tea and looked out at the lake and thought, "Here we go."